capital and thought, and it's just you've gone too far to turn around. And you want to be an example as well. And it goes for anything, whether it's in pursuit of a degree or certification or whatever it is, whatever your goal, your dreams are, whatever it is, you owe it to yourself to get to the point where you get to experience the exhilaration and the joy that comes from achievement. Nobody can really explain that to you. It's something that you just have to experience. And I promise you, it makes every single second of struggle and pain during the process worth it. Because when you hear those words or whatever it is that you achieve and you know that it's a done deal, there's a feeling that comes on you that just can't be explained. And that's of achievement. It's of accomplishment. It's of knowing that you did something worth it. And now you're being rewarded for it. And you owe it to yourself for that reason and that reason alone, right? And so I would encourage every one of you to hang in there with whatever it is that you are pursuing. Don't give up, no matter how long it takes. At the end of the day, it's not about how long it takes. It's about accomplishing, right? And never giving up and crossing the finish line. So that's my big announcement. But I'm just, again, grateful for all of you. Thank you for your congratulations. Thank all of you for your encouragement. And yes, I am beyond excited, relieved, and I feel like a lot of that shalom has returned. Like, you stay anxious and in chaos and all kinds of things, stress and this, that, and the other. You feel pulled apart. And but it was all worth it, and I'm grateful for it coming to a completion. So I see Oklahoma watching, Beaufort, Georgia is watching. Who else do we have? Yes, thank you so much. Thank all of you. Absolutely, dear brother. And thank you, Shelly Shell. I see you, Shawnee. I see you. Yes, indeed. What a pleasure it is. Thank you. And yes, indeed. Thank you so much. Thank all of you. And shout out from the DMV. It's watching. And yes, indeed. Thank all of you. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and jump in. Keep putting your congratulations up. Also letting us know where you are watching from. We love to know that. But here we go. So I'm going to bring my brothers on stage. So we are back in Genesis. And Genesis, we've got a lot more to unpack. And there we go. We've got a lot more to unpack in Genesis. And we took a little time off, but we are back. And no greater brothers to bring on for these segments here than, as I call them, the theological Idris Elba and the gospel Clark Kent. Where you at, man? Come on, Jay. Come on, man. Come on, brother. And we are the three amigos. But we spent a lot of time talking about Genesis that we have over the years. So I'm bringing my brothers back on, and we've done two segments already. We've dealt with things like Noah's getting drunk and that kind of deal, and we've talked about Sodom. We talked about Adam and Eve in the garden, and there's just so many good things in Genesis. But what we're really wanting to do is make sure that when we walk through Genesis, we are doing it in context, and we are considering more specifically the cultural and the literary context of Genesis. While language, I would say the linguistic is important, and I would say the geography is obviously important. I would even say the social context is important. All of these kinds of things, the theological context, and there's a number of other things. But in Genesis, two of the most important contextual analysis to consider for Genesis is definitely going to be cultural and literary, right? And so while we will be considering all of the context, we really want to bring that to its forefront, right? So we're looking at Genesis against its cultural and literary background. And so brothers, jump in, man. Talk to us, and then we can just jump in at I guess wherever we left off or wherever we're going to pick up from. I'm gonna just alley oop to you guys and take us away.
Yeah, you guys hear me?
Yeah, oh yeah, we can hear
awesome.
you.
Good.
Yep,
Yeah,
yep.
man, this is we gotta give one more congrats to Dr. Richardson.
100%.
It was wonderful sitting in on his dissertation defense, and it reignited my vigor to pursue the doctorate. I've been telling myself I've been taking this summer off so that I can start in my PhD program. But seeing that was like, man, I need to get on it. I need to join the team and join the field. But it's just good, man. I just wanted to congratulate you again, just because this is just a big deal. But as far as literary and cultural settings, especially I just gotta embellish it even more. It is extremely important that you familiarize yourself with those two contexts as it relates to Genesis, because of the disparity in time that we have between Genesis, the events that are shaped there, the events that are recorded there, and our time. The world that Genesis inhabits is vastly different than ours.
Right.
And so Genesis's world can speak into ours. It really can.
Right.
But if we try to understand Genesis purely from our perspective, you will inevitably miss some things. Now, this doesn't mean that you will miss the gospel or something like that, right? It isn't as if you have to have this in order to understand the gospel. But the point is if you're trying to understand the text as it was written, as it was intended to be communicated and understood, then you have to familiarize yourself with those contexts, because there are things in there that don't transfer over to us as cleanly as you would like. And so in order to interact with the text as best as possible, and to maybe become a fly on the wall, as it were, in looking at these events and understanding them and seeing how they flow into the entirety of the canon itself, you have to have those contexts inside of your interpretive cake mix, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, man, that's really good. That's a real good segue into the conversation, and some helpful considerations for navigating the text of Genesis. And I've seen people say things like Genesis decoded, and I don't like stuff like that. It sounds like Gnosticism, right? Like we're not trying to communicate that there's some hidden meaning, deep under layers and layers and layers. But what we are saying is that when we speak of layers, we're talking about unwrapping layers of culture and literary writing styles and conventions and all of the things that are actually there in the text already, right? So we're not adding anything to it. We're not putting anything to it. We're saying that we need lenses to see the layers that are there and to unwrap these things, because they're really already there. And we need a certain lens in order to be able to see them as they are, so that they really help to elucidate and shine greater light on the meaning of the text. So yeah, that's awesome. Jay, talk to us, brother.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. I also was privileged, first and foremost, to be there last night. It's just an amazing thing to see, after all the time that Damon has taken to put the work in, and listen to him last night. Yeah, it's super encouraging. I've been talking to the guys about trying to see where I can get on the ladder.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm saying, and I really appreciate what God has done in his life. One of the sayings that we joked about as we waited to hear what the verdict was going to be was somebody shouted out, "Who taught you?" And, the fact of the matter is, we all know where that came from, and just to hear that, and somebody also said it's one of the great things to be able to talk about. You already know, Michelle. You already know. One of the great things is being able to talk about scholars that we have learned from and listened to and have read, but we have a person that we can actually quote that we know.
Yeah. Oh man.
The validity of the work that he's put in, and the title is just amazing. So big congrats to you, D. Big congrats.
Appreciate it, man.
Yeah, it's I want to say it's been myself and Rick for the past probably 2 years have been going through Genesis and Exodus, and I think one of the statements Rick likes to make is when we talk about we're reading the scriptures literally, what do we mean by literally?
Right.
Is it because it says these particular words, or literal to the actual culture and context of the time?
Yeah.
And that's how we have to first understand when we're dealing with the beginning books of the Bible. We have the rule of the first mention, that understanding what that particularly means there to be able to interpret later on. So these are the things that we kind of look at to kind of make sure that we have, as previously said, the right lens to understand what are we reading. One thing I'll say, and I'll hand back to D, is the question was asked of the Ethiopian eunuch.
Yeah.
What are you reading? And he says, I'm reading Isaiah and blah, blah, blah. But here's the question that was asked of him. Do you understand what you are reading? And the Ethiopian eunuchs answered the question so perfectly. One of the things that I have taken as one of my own mottos to make sure that I'm always learning, he says, how can I understand except someone teach me?
Yes.
You can't take an ancient book and try to read it in your time without understanding what the original audience would have understood of that particular piece of writing.
Yeah.
And I just want to encourage us that as we go through and have been going through Genesis, that we understand the right lens is not what we think it means,
yeah,
but what the author meant and what the audience would have understood when they heard it.
That's good, man. Excellent. I fully agree. So let's jump into one of the texts in Genesis, and let's go to work. Where did we stop? I know we were bouncing around. Did we do chapter 10, the table of the nations? Did we deal with that yet, or where did we go?
We stopped at 9 last time. Yeah, we stopped at 9, and what we found out was I was right and that you were wrong. No.
That was good, Rick. That was so good.
I walked right into it. I got him. I got him now. That's where we left off, right?
That is exactly where we left off. That's good.
That's good. So let's you guys want to do the table of the nations? Is there anything there to discuss? I know typically people tend to look at this as essentially the origins of the nations, Europeans going north, Africans going south, and so forth and so on, and Mediterranean folks staying central, and this, that, or the other. And people tend to take a very literal view of Genesis 10 as essentially how we organize the races of nations and so forth and so on. Real quick, we don't even have to stay on this long. What's you guys' view on table of the nations there?
I think it's pretty straightforward as far as what it's meaning there. I think for the people that like to read Genesis literally and chronologically, Genesis 10 will cause a problem for you if you're trying to read it chronologically.
Right.
Because the events that you see in Genesis 10 seem to contradict the events that you see in Genesis 11. If you're reading it chronologically, if you're thinking it's sort of unfolding chronologically, but in reality, it's not.
Okay.
Because what you'll have in Genesis 10 is the spread of all the peoples. So we'll have the different languages that are consistent with these particular peoples. But then you get to 11, the whole earth is with one language. So what's going on here, right? Now, if you're reading it chronologically, you will have that problem to sort of surmount. But if it's not, if you're understanding that Moses is arranging these texts with a sort of rhetorical theological strategy involved, and chronology doesn't become a problem that you have to deal with. Okay. Another thing about nations themselves and the origins, Paul will pick up this very chapter in Acts chapter 17,
right,
where he is standing at the Areopagus, and is talking to the Greeks there. Now, the Greeks at the time had this idea called autochthonous origins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the autochthonous origins has to do with the Greeks thinking that because they sprang out of the ground of Greece, that they were of a cut above the rest as far as humanity was concerned. And so they are the highest, or the elites, so to speak, because of their origins. That's why Paul will say, but God has created from one man,
right,
and has set the boundaries, essentially saying, look, your idea of autochthonous origins is not real because God has set your boundaries. Mm-hmm. Your idea is defeated by the fact that Yahweh has set where you are. And now Yahweh is calling all men from all places to repent, because he has appointed a day when he will judge the earth, and so on and so forth. So he goes into that. So the Table of Nations is in the book of Acts, and Paul uses it again in order to defeat this idea that the Greeks had about their origins.
Got you. So, and I like that. So let me just ask you guys a question. So can we walk away from this text with the understanding, because as Genesis is unfolding, what we're seeing is this picture of sin's corruption of humanity, and how God is redemptively mitigating against it in a progression, a revelatory progression that ultimately, as we know it, culminates in the incarnation of his son. But as we are in Genesis, we're seeing this kind of slow unfolding of this corruption of humanity, and how God is also unfolding his redemptive meta-narrative as a mitigation against it. But he's allowing that story to unfold, because in order to appreciate the story of redemption, we've got to, in some senses, appreciate the degradation of sinfulness, right? And so is it safe to walk away from Genesis 10 with the view that the nations and their languages are a development of sinful rebellion? Not that there would not have been nations, or not that there would not have been languages, but it seems as, when we are looking at, for instance, the confusion that resulted from the rebellion, people began to gather around those that they could understand, and then the human family began to spread out into multiple communities as God had intended. But what catapults them into these nations, and ultimately nations form, but into these language communities around which they can understand, is ultimately their rebellion. So God has to use that in order to accomplish the Noahide mandate that he had given the family to, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, which was a renewal of the Genesis mandate that he had given to Adam and Eve. Am I on good theological ground here? Am I off? Are the nations in effect and languages the result of rebellion, sinful rebellion? Am I on good theological ground?
I would say yes. The quick answer, I would say yes.
Good.
I think so. I think so as well. So here's the thing about that makes that sort of difficult to just have a concrete yes. It's because the diversity in the human family is also something that God is glorified in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very hard to sort of I mean, I do agree with you. I mean, you see, especially in Genesis 11, I think we're about to go into Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel now. Sounds like it. I think the scattering is both a judgment, and it is a part of how God wants to accomplish his purposes. Because remember, the first commission in the Bible is found in chapter 1 there, where they are told to be fruitful and multiply, to have dominion, to subdue the earth, and to fill the earth. So there would have been a filling, an outworking, a spreading out. Now, one could argue that the languages themselves wouldn't have came about because, or only came about because of the unified sort of action that we see at Babel. I mean, I'm fine with agreeing with that, but you also see this diversity as something that is not completely disavowed,
right?
Because even at Pentecost, the human languages aren't done away with.
Right.
God uses language to demonstrate a unification underneath the lordship of Jesus Christ and what he has inaugurated in and through his ministry. And so, I think we have to have a very nuanced answer to this, because in the eschatological vision, especially in like Revelation chapter 7, where it talks about that great multitude,
right?
And John is very particular when he keeps the ethnic distinctive markers, one of which is language.
Yeah.
That this multitude still is consisting of. It's from every tribe, every tongue, every people, every nation. They're all surrounding the throne. They're all clothed in the same clothing. They're all saying the same thing, but it doesn't mean that they're saying the same thing in the same language, but they're all saying the same thing in the differing languages. And so,
So I was about to say, I'm going to use a big word, in the recapitulation of eschatology, as everything moves towards this restoration of all things, right? And God does something new in this new earth. Obviously, the nations will be there. Are there going to be multiple languages? Are there going to be multiple nationalities in this new earth? If sin's gone, and and all of the things that created, all of the things that are essentially the byproducts of sin have been removed, and there's this new earth, this recapitulation of sorts. I wonder though, are there going to be more than one language? You quoted a text around one of the throne scenes there in Revelation, where there certainly seems to be nations or nationalities of people is the idea, and them speaking in multiple languages. I just thought about that. If there's going to be a newness there and a new creation, a new creative order, it makes me wonder. And the reason this is not just pure speculation. The reason I'm wondering this is that I think this would go back. This could inform what we're reading here. Is that what we're reading in, for instance, 11 is ultimately really what God wanted anyway. He essentially accomplished his will even through their rebellion. And I'll link that to what we read in Acts. For instance, he had told them, Jesus had given them the mandate that you should receive the Holy Spirit. You shall receive power when the Holy Spirit's come upon you, and you shall be witnesses. And he's given this commission here to the apostles that they are to bear witness of him, his person and work, the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the uttermost parts to the ends of the earth. Well, they don't immediately accomplish this. In fact, by the time we're in Genesis 6 and there's a little bit of persecution, it says that that the apostles remained in Jerusalem. And it doesn't seem like you really start seeing the gospel spread throughout the Mediterranean world until God instigated persecution. And so I think one way to read this is that just because God uses something doesn't mean that the outcome of it wasn't already what he intended anyway, right? And so we know he intended for them to spread out and bear witness, but they weren't accomplishing that. So he instigates persecution, which causes believers to start going all over the place, ultimately, therefore, bringing the gospel with them. And I wonder if that informs the way we ultimately end up reading the Babel narrative as well, is that, well, we know God wanted them to spread out. We heard the way that he instructed Noah's family, and as obviously a renewal of the Genesis mandate. So when they don't accomplish that, in the Chaldean language, Babel actually means the gate of God, whereas in the Hebrew, they call it confusion. So it's like when we say stop babbling, that's where that idea comes from. But it seems to suggest that God only used the confusion to ultimately accomplish what he was wanting them to do anyway. So I think in that sense, maybe it's not proper to say that languages and nations are the result of sin, but that God used their rebellion instrumentally use the confusion as a way to judge them in order to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish anyway, right? So it was always his plan for nations and languages and all of these other things to result. What do you think of that? Am I off on that, or am I making the right connections? We can't hear you, Rick. Go ahead.
I think you're right to say it that way. I don't think that it is purely a judgment. The thing about Babel in particular, God is judging their rebellious behavior, but he's also working out his plans and purposes in and through it, or despite their behavior, and utilizing it. The scattering also is a grace on them because they are unified in the project of inviting God down. Because what's going on at Babel is a arrogant, rebellious action that's taking place by humanity, but it is also this desire for humanity to have divine presence in their midst. Now, it's pretty much a known fact in Old Testament scholarship now that the Tower of Babel is a ziggurat, or was a ziggurat.
Right.
And that right there, this is so when Damon opens up this live with, hey, we have to have a familiarity with the cultural setting. This is where this really makes a lot of money for you, so to speak.
Right.
The historical and cultural setting helps us understand what a ziggurat was used for. The ziggurat was not something that humans used to walk or to assault the divine realm, actually. What it was a sort of executive elevator that the gods used to basically move from the divine realm into the realm where the humans lived and were able to dwell with them. That's why ziggurats were adjoined to temple complexes. And so you'd have a little room at the top of the ziggurat that the deity would come down. And then the thought was he would come down from where he was and then dwell with us in the city. We would be able to reap the benefits of having a deity in our midst, and the deity would reap the benefits of the worship that would now be had because he's in our midst. That's sort
Yeah.
of how it worked. And so
That's
in
right.
that sense, you see Babel as a sort of managed worship or a domestication of God. And when you understand it like that, you'll recognize that human nature has always, sinful human nature, has always tried to do that with God. We've always tried to approach God on our
Mhm.
terms, or to manage
Right.
the divine and say, well, hey, I will enter in this relationship with you, God, but you do this and I'll do that. And that is the transaction.
Yeah.
And what God does is he rejects it altogether. And what makes this
Mhm.
even more concrete is how Moses sets this up literarily, right? How he structures the book in juxtapositioning chapter 11 with chapter 12, because in chapter 11, you have the people saying that they want to make their name great, right?
Right.
That's their desire.
Right.
But in chapter 12, God picks a one particular man so that
I'm gonna
he
make
can
your
make
name great.
his name great.
Here you go. Come on.
And in that regard, he's rejecting the first advance and
Yeah.
now choosing the way in which it will actually go in and
Yeah.
through the man that he has chosen, and on the election, on the chosenness, on his prerogative, so to speak,
Yeah.
of how he will accomplish his plans. And that is in and through Abram, and on goes the book of Genesis, culminating in the Exodus story that will come about in the next book. But yeah, I think looking at it purely as just people trying to assault the divine realm is really to miss the point of the chapter itself, I think.
Yeah.
So
When
let me just
go ahead.
understand what both of you are saying. So are we saying then that language was always going to be a thing, because we have the earth is of one language and of one tongue, and the only time we see the breakout of languages is on the rebellion? So are we saying that language was always the plan of God for man? Because spreading out is one thing, multiplying is one thing, but then the language now is something that we have to be able to answer for. And by what you guys are saying is that language was always a part of this original command that God gave to man to spread out. Is that what you guys are saying?
I think nations and therefore languages, because languages is a metonymy for nations, and so I do think that was ultimately God's plan because of their rebellion to stay in one place. So think about it. Think about it. Why is he judging them? Because he doesn't want them to remain there. Remaining there in Shinar as one particular people group with one language seems to be the idea that God is saying, no, that's not what I want to have happen, right? So it seems to suggest that ultimately nations and languages would have grown out of their migration in various directions. But because they settle upon one area in rebellion, their motive was, notice what they say in chapter 11, come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. So that speaks to, of course, what Rick was just talking about in terms of worship. But when they also said this, they said, let's make a name for ourselves, otherwise we will be scattered throughout the earth. There's an indication that they seem to know that what they were doing wasn't what God wanted, and therefore God creates confusion in their language in order to ultimately accomplish what he wanted to naturally evolve out of their various migrations. It's like saying, okay, the gospel spread again because of persecution, because the people didn't want to leave Jerusalem. Would we conclude then that what results from that is sinfulness, or would we conclude that, well, that's what God ultimately wanted, and he just simply utilized kind of like a mother bird making the nest just a little less comfortable, so as to kind of prod the baby to take your leap, get out of the nest and fly. Otherwise, you're not going to survive, right? And so they've got to let some of the thorns kind of stick through after a while, so that the bird gets the idea that you're no longer welcome here. You've got to get out and fly. And however God accomplishes that ultimately is just the medium to get people where he was wanting them to go anyway. So I do want to back up for a second where in 4, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky. Rick, how would you link that with what we read later? Because again, we're looking at some of the pagan cultural ideas. As people are moving away from God, Romans 1, they are also simultaneously suppressing the knowledge of who God is, the knowledge of truth, and we start to see some development of worshiping other deities and all kinds of things that they have invented. Am I on good ground here to make the connection intertextually with when Yahweh's theophany visits Jacob, and in his vision, there is Jacob's ladder? This is like this portal wherein the angels are ascending indeed. Talk to us, brothers.
Yeah, I think there is a good connection. I think the difference is who creates that.
Right.
That's one big difference that you have to notice. So I think what's happening here is the reason why you would see a ladder or that sort of similar building is because God is contextualizing the revelation to the particular individual at the time, and that time is Jacob.
Mm.
And so you would expect to see something that looks similar, but the difference is in chapter 11, the people are building it. And in this instance with Jacob's ladder, God is the one who's building it. And now you see angels descending and descending, which gives this idea of an authorization. This is what God has authored.
Right.
This is working as it is as it's supposed to. It's not something of a human invention.
There we go.
And so I think it does capture that idea there. But I think the key difference is in the first instance with 11, it's the humans thinking this up, building it, defining it, and again, defining its usage and its purpose. Where in the other instance, the later instance with Jacob, this is God defining it. And all Jacob is doing is merely recognizing it. He is not offering any interpretation. He's not saying, hey, God, I would like it to look like this. No, God is revealing what this means and that he would be with him, essentially. And so we understand that after that takes place, Jacob's name is also now Israel, the one who struggles with God. And so that has some theological significance as to how the nation itself will be that very thing. They will be the people who struggle and strive with God.
Wonderful. So let's unless Jay, you want to jump in there, let's back up to, is it Genesis 6? Is it 6 where the flood is? God begins to warn Noah in chapter 6, and then in chapter 7 they enter the ark, and then there's the flood. So let's go to chapter 7. Let's talk for a minute about the flood. All right. So let me just read this text here, just really quickly here. All right. Chapter 7, Verse 7. So Noah, his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives entered the ark because of the floodwaters. From the animals that are clean, and from the animals that are not clean, and from the birds and every creature that crawls on the ground, 2 of each, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark just as God had commanded him. 7 days later, the floodwaters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the sources of the vast watery depths burst open. The floodgates of the sky were open, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On that same day, Noah, along with his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, entered the ark along with Noah's wife and his 3 sons' wives. They entered it with all of the wildlife according to their kinds, all livestock according to their kinds, all the creatures that crawl on the earth according to their kinds, every flying creature, all the birds, every winged creature according to their kind. 2 of every creature that has the breath of life in it came to Noah and entered the ark. And I can go on and on and on about the floodwaters surging, greatly increasing on the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the water in verse 18. The water surged even higher on the earth, and all the high mountains under the whole sky were covered. The mountains were covered as the water surged above them more than 20 feet. Every creature perished, those that crawl on the earth, birds, livestock, wildlife, and those that swarm on the earth as well, as all mankind. Everything with the breath of the spirit of life in its nostrils, everything on dry land died. He wiped out every living thing that was on the face of the earth, from mankind to livestock to creatures that crawl to the birds of the sky, and they were wiped off the earth. Okay. Here we go. Jay, you ready? Universal flood or regional flood? Universal flood or regional flood? Did the floodwaters cover the entire earth, as in every part, or did it cover regionally all of the known earth that they knew in a particular region where people lived? Because obviously people were not living all over the earth as they are today. So how would we, and we get that things in scripture are being described phenomenologically. That is how, as they appear to them. So when they say it was all over the earth, as far as they know, from their perspective, that's true. They're communicating what seems to be true to them. This is as, so what do you all think? Regional, global, as in every part?
Yeah.
What's Moses telling us here?
I think that framing there is honestly not the right framing to have, because it puts us in this either or, and there's really about 5 different views of the flood. So you have the popular one, which most people interact with, which is the global worldwide flood view, flood geology, essentially. And that is the entirety of the earth was inundated in a flood everywhere. The tip of Argentina, the top of think of any place in the world was underneath the water, right? Then you have the next view is a local flood theory,
right?
After that is a participant perspective view, so meaning that the family members, Noah included, from their particular view, they thought it was the entirety of the world. And so even in that view, that's still advocating for a local flood view, but
Regional,
from
yeah.
their
Mhm.
perspective, it was the whole world. And then you have the liberal theological contribution, if you could call it that, and that is the mythological view. This is just a
Right.
myth.
Yeah.
And then there is a fifth view that I sort of adopt, which is from, this isn't my view at all. I didn't come up with it. This is from a book written by Doctors Tremper Longman and John Walton. They wrote a
Mhm.
book about the flood itself, and that is what they call the author's view, and that is a theological history and a rhetorical hyperbole view. Well, they will call it a regional flood that has cosmic theological
Mm.
implications. And so in that regard, it is a global flood, but it's not meant to be historically or scientifically reconstructed, because Moses is not speaking to science. And if it was, this is part of their argument as to why they don't think it's a global flood, is because there is zero record in the geology of a global flood. We
Right.
would see it. And so those are the varying views. My view is that last view there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that view encompasses the all of the regional aspects of the flood. It encompasses the phenomenological perspectives, and what it seems to incorporate is, while those things physically did occur, the reason the story is being told is because it's also serving a greater theological purpose. So I think all of that is true, right? It doesn't mean that the flood didn't occur, right? Because that would be the liberal view, that this is a myth. So we're reading about something that's a historical event. Just to be clear, this is a historical event. This event was an actual flood of some proportions that resulted in the complete devastation of life, aside from all of the persons who did enter into the ark. So just to be clear, we're saying that that is literal, what we're reading there, in terms of it having occurred, as in a flood, loss of life. Talk to us though about the animals. Um, how and we'll get to the theological piece, but should we be understanding that part literally, as in, well, here's how animals survived? They had to get in the ark too.
Now, I don't think that we should think that this is how animals survived, because again, I don't believe that Moses is recording a global deluge. He's recording probably a cataclysmic regional flood that took place that was huge,
Yeah.
that absolutely was devastating. The authors of the book that I was referring to,
Mhm.
they point to a possible event that did take place historically about 5600 BC, wherein the you know how, like, I think it's the Caspian Sea was formed, where it broke through and it just flooded that entire region where Ararat is, and you can tell that's where,
Yeah.
like, Armenia and all that place is, and it sort of affected that area there. That's what they point to. But again, that doesn't mean that Moses is calling us to try to put together the scientific fact again. He's not trying to do that. That's not his point.
Right.
And so when we get into the hyperbolic language itself, I think the mention of the animals is just the theological way of saying that God is providing a way in which life will continue after this act of decreation has taken place, because we have to frame the flood itself as an act of decreation. The world starts off in a state called tohu vabohu,
Mhm.
formless and void. It's sort of like a undifferentiated land and water, sort of watery mass. There's no lines, there's no boundaries. But then you see in Genesis 1 where God draws, he separates the waters above, the waters below. He sets the boundaries for the land. And so now you get this sense of God is ordering the entirety of the cosmos, where thing will be and where a thing
Land
won't be. So
emerges. Yeah.
all of that. Yep. And then as a result of human sin, God plunges humanity or the earth itself back into that state where the waters are now, there's no boundary anymore. And then you see at the end of the flood narrative, God promises to not do that again. And so he sets the boundaries back afterward. And so I just seem to think that because those are all present in the text, that the mention of the animals is functioning more theologically than it would be, I guess, to use our modern use of the word literal, it would, functioning more literally. I don't think it's because I don't even think that the dimensions of the ark are meant to be literal. Is this? I don't think they are. I just don't think they are. I don't think that's the case.
So given that view, do you think that might leave room for somebody to say, well, if you feel that there's some liberty there to think that, well, that's kind of metaphorical. It's theological there. It's not something that really happened. What's to stop? I mean, how does that not put the foot in the door for the person to say, well, I really don't think he's saying that he's meaning that about the people either, right? Nobody really went into the ark, right? If the animals didn't go into the ark, then perhaps the people didn't go into the ark either. Maybe this is just serving as a metaphorical way of saying something else, right? And so I would be cautioned to give up that kind of ground, because I don't see any other way to stop somebody from putting their foot in the door and say, hold on. Well, if that's the case, I don't think people went in either. That we're not looking at people being saved from loss, or animals and people being saved from, because the text repeats like several times, and everything that was breathing died, perished, right? And so if that's true, and that's not hyperbolic, if that's not some synecdoche, then everything that was breathing other than what went into that ark died. Now, if I'm saying there's global, if I'm saying it's regional, then I am accounting for the fact that there are other animals in other areas. So I do not believe clearly that all animals survived because two of possible every kind of thing fit into the ark. There's clearly other animals out there. So if this is regional, I could see where there's the preservation of some animals and the rest perished, just like there's the preservation of some people and the rest perished. But I don't think clearly that all animals everywhere upon the face of the earth perished. And the reason that we were able to get giraffes again and lions, and this is all possible species of animals, 2 by 2, went into the ark. I think that would be insane. And given the dimensions of the ark is essentially shorter than what is it? The ark in length would be shorter than I think 3.5 city buses long in length, right? And then height is essentially about the I think about a football field in height, 100 yards or so. But you'd have to be looking in length at about 3.5 city buses. That's not a whole lot of room for everything possible. You know what I mean? So it's big, but it doesn't even begin to compare to any of your like Carnival cruise lines. It's like it's not even a quarter of the size of a Carnival cruise liner. Like that is huge. But the ark in dimension is a sizable boat, but it ain't gonna house every possible animal of every kind. so that animal species only survive because two of each are preserved in the ark. So I definitely would not agree that that's what's going on there, that certainly there are other animals. But I do think that there is some indication of preservation of life versus judgment. And in this particular area, because of what? Because of corruption, because of the spread of sin. And so again, there's this constant redemptive mitigation against this spread of and corruption of sin and humanity, and how God is constantly bringing about judgment as he is simultaneously unfolding his redemptive plan. But but I do agree. I think there's some literary stylistics that are going on. Obviously, he's telling a greater story than just what happened. There is what happened, and here's what Yahweh is trying to communicate about what happened. But I do think that if we don't at least give some credence to what happened, there's no real basis out of which to say, well, here's what Yahweh is saying. Because if Yahweh is saying something, it's predicated on the realness and the reality and the authenticity of what actually happened. Take that away, and is Yahweh saying any? You know what I mean? What is the where is the credibility of what Yahweh is saying if things didn't really occur? You get my point?
I do.
Yeah.
But that is exactly why I said that I would defer to you guys, because I would not have an argument, because even by the both of what you guys are saying, there is no definition or any foundation or solid, oh, this is the answer to. And as you rightly said, how do we answer for those people that say, well, yeah, nobody went in the ark then? How do we answer for that when we are not even 100% solidified on how we are to interpret the flood, as in global, as in regional, even though I do believe that the flood was as far as those individuals were there could see and what they understood. I believe that. However, as for the worldwide and no animals going into the ark, now we've got issues, because how do we answer for that?
Right.
And I'm even asking, how do we answer for that? If we say there's no animals that went into the ark, how do we answer for that?
Right.
I wouldn't say that there's no animals that went into the ark. I would just say that the point of the text is not to tell a line by line, event by event narrative like that. Think of it like this. I used this analogy last time, and I'm borrowing this analogy from Walton here. He talks about how Moses is writing history imagistically, right? And he uses the difference between the Hubble telescope and Van Gogh's depiction of the night sky. Both of these two pictures are depicting the night sky. The Hubble telescope is something that you can conduct astronomy on. You can map the stars. You can do the math with that picture.
Right.
But you can't do the math with Van Gogh's depiction of the starry night. But both of them aren't. It isn't like this one's telling the truth and this one's lying. Both of them are depicting the night sky. But the point is you wouldn't try to recreate the night sky from Van Gogh's depiction. You can with the Hubble telescope. And so I think the problem here is people are trying to recreate the event. And I think that's one of the big issues I have with like the ark encounter. That's what it's trying to do. It's trying to take from a sort of wooden fundamentalist reading of the text, a wooden literal fundamentalist reading of the text, and then it recreates everything. And then on that basis and from that paradigm, it says this is true, which automatically makes any sort of nuance get into the realm of, okay, if it differs from this literal sort of understanding that we have fashioned and thought of, that means that it's either it's just fictitious and you're just engaging in sort of liberal theology. And that's not the case. We can still have this view where it's sort of imagistic and it not be liberal at all. It's still dealing with the text, because we're asking the better question of what is the story that Moses is telling, and is the story of the flood incidental to his larger rhetorical theological point, or is it the point that he's trying to make? And I think it's the former. It is just incidental to his larger point that he is telling throughout the book of Genesis, culminating to, again, toward which I think the audience of Genesis, the audience of Exodus, the rest of the first 5 books, is Israel post the deliverance in Egypt. These stories are told to them. Like the flood's not told to Noah, it's not told to Jacob, it's not told to Abraham, it's told to Israel. And so Moses has a point as to why he's even mentioning this text. There's a point as to why he's mentioning the tower, why he's mentioning Abraham, why he's mentioning what's going on in Genesis, say 34 with Dinah and Levi and Jacob and people at Shechem there, right? There's a point of why he's mentioning that. And instead of trying to recreate the event and say, okay, let's just do the math around it, we have to track with what Moses is doing with the story, not just let's recreate the story itself.
So before we go on from this, I want to just spend a couple of more minutes here. I agree with you there. I do think, though, that the text itself is still worth looking at for its elements, right? Because if we just say, well, the point is this, don't worry about any of the form or the shape of the text, the particular elements at all. Let's just focus on the point. Then it seems like the point itself starts to lose value if none of the things, the elements in the text, can be trusted to be literal in some sense, right? So I get that we should not be trying to reconstruct scientific, exactness and all of these kind of things from the text. But as we consider the point, we should, in the process of considering the point, at least be able to look at the text and say, this happened and this didn't happen, right? Or this is real and this is not real, right? I think that's legitimate. Like, was this either a flood or not? Like, I don't have to have all the details, but I ought to at least be able to look at the text and say, so there was an actual real flood that people died in. Like, that did happen. I ought to be able to look at the text and at least conclude that Yahweh is making a distinction. That I think what he's saying, I like what you said, because that's what we've been doing this whole time, is why is Moses saying this? Why does God have him saying this? Because when we see 8 people being saved in the ark, they are being preserved against the backdrop of corruption and other things going on around them. So there is this distinction between them in the ark being preserved and then those around them perishing. And I think as Israel is walking through the land, preservation is a theme in Genesis. God keeping his people as an ecclesia, as a called out group of people, preserving them as those who are perishing around them in all of their rebellious culture and all of that. There is a distinction between these folk here that God is with, preserving, and those folk around them who are lost and in rebellion. And the flood narrative seems to capture that theology, but it can only capture that theology against the backdrop of some historical event. So when he's talking about Jonah, that actually happened, and yet it's serving to inform a later generation about the dangers of becoming obsessed with the cultures of the world. You see what I mean? And so I'm saying
I do.
There ought to be some value and some validity to looking at these as real historical events, even if we don't make too much of it, but some basis of being able to say, okay, this is what happened. right? And we don't have all the details, but here's what we can make of this. And then here's the point. But if we just talk about a point, what value is the point without being able to know what to do with the historical piece? Like, what do we do with that, right? And so, but I do get you. People do make more than they need to out of it, and then they get hyper fixated on the size of the ark and what actually fit, and then you get stuff like the ark encounter and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
Right. I agree with you. I agree with you there. So, yeah.
You know, I think you're right on the money with that, because that's how the biblical writers deal with the event. They do not treat it as some mythological, fictional story. When Peter recalls it, he utilizes it. He says, look, the flood actually took place.
That's exactly where I was going.
But then he uses it for its theological purpose. But again, he's still referring to it as an actual historical event.
Mm-hmm.
Like in 2 Peter, he'll use it. And then, you know, where it talks about in where's the 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. Right. He talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, another event that took place. And so, but he uses it to frame this sense of, hey, these scoffers, because he starts off chapter 2 talking about, hey, there's scoffers back then, there's scoffers right now, but look, God has receipts. Let me pull them up. Because they were scoffing when the flood was coming. They were scoffing at Sodom and Gomorrah, but don't worry about the scoffers, because God will deal with them.
Right.
And just so you want to know if God will deal with them, let's see how God dealt with them before. And
right.
So he's again referring to the flood as a historical event, which I think it is. I think it's an actual flood did take place.
Right.
But the point of it was to demonstrate that God judges sin. And that's what Peter's doing with the flood. So he is both acknowledging that it is a historical event, but then you see him quickly pivot to the use of it, where it's how he can employ it theologically to make the point to his current audience at the time.
Right. I agree.
think that's the sort of proper way to look at the flood, because that's how the biblical writers are dealing with the flood.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. That's good. I wanted to spend at least a little time on this so that we could look at, again, the literary cultural context and obviously consider the theological context. So that is a part of the contextualization as well. So, you know, what's the theological context here? Where are we going from here? Is it Genesis 22? Where are we going from here?
I think that was the next one on the list. It was Genesis 22.
Yeah, Abraham and his son Isaac.
All right. Somebody want to read that? Somebody want to read it?
What verses are we going to be reading from? Because that's a big chapter. I can read the whole chapter.
We can skip around. We're mostly talking about, of course. It stops at verse 19 in terms of the episode of the sacrifice of Isaac, right? So we can even kind of skip around there, read some of the main verses in that 1 through 19 pericope.
Right. So I think
we can just talk about it, because we're going to be obviously discussing the text anyway. So let's just talk about it.
And this is the text that records the sacrifice of Isaac.
Yeah.
And so we all know how that starts off. God comes to Abram and tells him, hey, you need to go sacrifice Isaac. And Abraham proceeds to do that, to obey. Right. And the angel of the Lord calls out to Abram. And just as a side note, that is the first instance in the Bible wherein you see a doubling of the name.
Mm-hmm.
This is very significant, especially when this is on a completely different subject, but this is a doubling of the name.
Right.
You see this doubling of the name in what I call the most scariest verse in the Bible, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, where Jesus says, many will come to me on that day saying, Lord, Lord.
Yeah.
Haven't we prophesied in your name? Done many mighty works in your name? And then Jesus says, look, I don't know y'all. I never knew y'all. Get away from me. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. They double the name. The doubling of a name is a literary device wherein when you do it, the person who double, let's just say I doubled Jason's name. I go, Jason. What I'm doing in biblical literature is I'm expressing affection, loyalty, love, commitment toward the person I'm calling, right? I'm saying that I love you by the fact that I am doubling your name. So you see the angel of the Lord here saying, Abram, indicating that he has a love for Abraham. But then when you get into Matthew chapter 7, these people think they love Jesus. That's why they doubled the title Lord.
That's good.
And so the point of what Jesus is making there is not about whether you love Jesus. It's about whether Jesus loves you. That's why Jesus will say, look, I never knew you.
Never knew you. Yeah.
I never knew you. Not that, hey, I knew you and then you did something and now I don't know you. Jesus says there was never a time when I knew you, but you've convinced yourself that you do. And you know, that I think the basis for why they are unknown by God is they base the relationship with Jesus on their works and not on his ability to save them. And I think that's what the big difference is as to why. But this is the first instance in the text where you see a doubling of the name, and then you'll see it progressed out.
That's good. So it's not merely about emphasis as it's often stated, you know. So your emphasis, truly, I say unto you, that's emphasis. And so that's really good. I like the elucidation there from the culture, so that it really shines a little bit more light on why we actually see things written. And so again, when we say literary, we're saying how things are written, the conventions, the style, why this was so, and how people understood it. And so that really does make a lot of sense, you know, as you read the text there. What else do we have going on here in Genesis 22? Talk to us, Jay.
Verse 2, take your son, he said, your only son, Isaac, to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on the mountains I will tell you about. The first thing that I want to pull up is that term, your only son. We have the word there is not what is that? The word here is yakid. What's the other word? It just slipped my mind.
Echad.
That's the word I was looking for. Echad. This is not the word echad here. This is the word yakid. And the question would be, how is God calling Isaac his only son when he has Ishmael? But this was the only son of promise. This was deemed as his only son because Abraham asked God the question, can not Ishmael be put before you and put before you as the one to be the promise? And God told him no. So the use of this word here as only, even though he has two sons, literally, the term only is pointing towards the only one of promise. The last time we spoke about the different lines of generations that God would be speaking from, whether it be the line of the devil, the serpent, or the line of Christ, or the line of that which will bring forth that seed. And we see here that Isaac is that one from which Jacob would come, basically. The good seed, the good line that would bring forth the children of Israel. So just seeing that only son, just making sure we understand why it's not only in the sense that he doesn't have any more sons, but the only as the only one who was promised. And this idea, the question that you asked when we was putting this together, why does God ask Abraham to offer up his son? Is he promoting child sacrifice? And God is not doing asking Abraham of child sacrifice, because what he's doing is testing him. We were talking about this today in Bible study, about how God uses different areas to build up the faith of the one that he has called. He asks Abraham to sacrifice his son to see, not for God's sake, but for Abraham's sake, to see how much he loved God and believed in the word that God had promised him. Abraham knows that the promise comes through Isaac. However, he had enough faith to believe, as Hebrews said, that his son would be raised. If he was to die, his son would be raised. So we see the faith of Abraham in this text, where even though he doesn't know where this sacrifice is going to come from, how God is going to deliver his son, this area we see how God uses this idea of sacrificing his son, yet because he believed in God, he know that God would make a way.
That's good. That's good. You raise a really good point, Jay, about child sacrifice. I don't think there would be any instance in which Yahweh would have ever accepted
100%.
A human being offered by another human in terms of child sacrifice or whatever. Granted, Isaac is an adult, not even a child, so he's a grown man. But even in that, right, there's kind of a twofold thing. There is the test of Abraham's obedience to God, but the subtext, that which is just not stated, but it's there, is obviously Isaac's submission to Abraham. It doesn't state it, but it's subtext to it, because he's not a kid, he's a grown man. And when it becomes apparent that he is the sacrifice, he submits. And you could see like a through line to the gospel. One, there is this idea of monogenes, where, as you mentioned, his only son. There is the willingness of the father to give his son, right? And then there is the submission of the son to the father. You could see like there's this through line straight to the gospel that is happening here. And although I wouldn't say that sacrifice is never acceptable to God. Pagan sacrifices weren't acceptable to God, but when we consider the fact that the Logos, the eternal Logos, the one and only Son, sacrificed his life humanly, and that was acceptable to God, I think there is some basis to say that human sacrifice is acceptable to God. It just depends on, if we go back to Rick's framework earlier, it goes back to who's calling for it. Because if God, the Father, is calling for the sacrifice of his son, that's acceptable to him. But if people in rebellion are constructing means of sacrifice that God hasn't called for, he doesn't accept that, and he has the prerogative to reject those things, because those things are not in line with his will. They are done in rebellion and in sin, so forth and so on. So I think when we even think about human sacrifice, I think there is a sense in which what we are actually seeing is not something that we need to really be afraid of or reject. Human sacrifice is acceptable to God the Father if it is what he has called for, if it is done, if it is what he has planned. And certainly the only human sacrifice that the Father has ever planned for or called for is the sacrifice of his one and only son, right? You know what I mean? But I think that's what this is actually pointing to. So I would only reject human sacrifice that's done in a pagan context, because clearly those are not being done as worship to the one and true God. Second, the one true God has never asked for that, right? See what I mean? So that would automatically mean that's why it would be wrong, because he hadn't asked for it. But when he's asking for it here, if Abraham had gone through with it, it would have been acceptable to God. I like the way that the writer of Hebrews frames it, though. The writer of Hebrews frames it as though it did occur. He says, and by faith, Abraham offered his son Isaac, to show that, and this goes to even what Jesus was doing in the Beatitudes, you know, when he's talking about, if you can conceptualize doing something in your heart, it is as though you have actually done that thing, right? And so Abraham goes through with it. He has every intention. He has the faith, the confidence, the trust in God is there. And only God's hand stops him. And yet God counts it as though he actually accomplishes it. I think that's remarkable when we look at that and the parallels to the gospel there. Jump in, Rick.
Yeah, I think also New Testament writer picks this up as a demonstration of faith in action, where James will pick this up in James chapter 2, I believe, where he talks about, well, you say you have faith, and I'll show you my faith by my actions.
Mm-hmm.
And he refers to Abraham in this episode in Genesis 22, but Paul will refer to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15 and in Genesis chapter 12. It's particularly Genesis chapter 15, where it says Abraham believed and it was reckoned unto him, or accounted unto him as righteousness. And so Abraham is already righteous when he's in Genesis 22. He's already accounted as righteous.
That's right.
Now you get to see it with evidence behind it. And so that's how James will pick it up and say, well, look, faith without works is dead, essentially. What Paul will say, we're justified apart from works, or without works. We're justified by faith. So how do these two things work? Where you kind of see it worked out in the episodes in which both Paul and James appeal to Abraham, because they both appeal to the same guy. They just appeal to him in different areas and time frames of his life. And that's very significant as to why they aren't contradicting each other. Because Abraham is demonstrating the reality that he already is righteous by obeying God and believing him, that, like the writer of Hebrews will say, even if he did go all the way through and drop the knife into Isaac, that God would raise him back up, because he believed God that much. And so I think that's the point itself. And I think you're right to sort of frame that this is not a child sacrifice, because Isaac is not a young kid in this instance. Isaac is probably in his 20s right now. He is a grown man, and he is, as being that, having the faculties and the volitional ability to say, hey, I don't want to do this, but he does. And I think it demonstrates there's just too many overlaps theologically and sort of what we would say typologically with what Jesus does. As you see, I mean, even the location has a sort of typological significance, because it's the same location that the threshing floor is eventually bought at, and Jerusalem is built in this same area later on. And so they believe that the Temple Mount is at this same location wherein Isaac is offered, where the temple is built upon, in the same spot. And so there's just too many overlaps wherein you can't. You know, I'm one who always likes to caution and say, hey, well, let's not just rush to Jesus real quick.
Right.
But this is one where, rush to Jesus, because it's just too much overlaps here. Way too much overlaps.
Yeah. In verse 14, I think this is something really good to discuss. And Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So today it is said it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Now, what it's clearly talking about is God providing the substitute. And so you've got some, redemptive theology going on there. But Yahweh is the one providing the ram. The ram is the substitute in place of Isaac. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is, it says, and Abraham named that place Yahweh Yireh, right? Yahweh Yireh, right? Others might recognize Jehovah Jireh, but that's not the reading. It's Yahweh Yireh, right? That means the Lord provided. Now, the reason I want to bring this up is to kind of pop the balloon on a pop theology, and I know where it comes from, but this pop theology about praying the names of God. He's Jehovah Shalom, the Lord our peace. He's Jehovah Shammah, the Lord is there. He's Jehovah Sikkenu, the Lord our righteousness. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord our provider. Jehovah Rohi, the Lord our shepherd. Jehovah Rapha, the Lord our healer. And then people learn that they've learned this. I remember there was this one book, Could You Not Tarry 1 Hour, by this guy named Larry Lee. And he popularized that in that book. And even Shirley Caesar had a song singing about it. And it just became real pop theology. But one of the things that I noticed, over the years is that there are no places in scripture where people were calling Yahweh that. In fact, everywhere that those texts are mentioned, places are being named that because of what Yahweh did there. Now that is a game changer, because God does have various names. That's true. His name is not Jehovah Jireh or Yahweh Yireh. It says, and Abraham named that place. Never said he called God that. In other words, the convention in the culture is to name places according to things that occurred there or things that God did in a particular place. But this has nothing to do with what they called God. It's a cultural practice of dedicating a place as a memorial, as a reminder. And so sometimes they would use stones to say, remember what happened here. Other times they would use names, because the names would be the link to what Yahweh did there. Yahweh provided there. But it's not some theology whereby folk are saying, oh yeah, okay, that's another name for God. Yahweh Yireh, let's call him that. Every time we need some food or we need some provision, let's call on Yahweh Yireh, right? That's not good theology. That's not biblical theology. That's pop theology. That's not how we would understand this. And if you were to go into every one of those verses that mention Shammah and Shalom and Sitkanu and all those other places, you'll find the exact same thing. And they call that place. So that is one of the things I wanted to bring out is that we've got to stop. Listen, when we know better, we do better. There is just no biblical basis for calling God Jehovah Shammah, because that's just not his name, right? It's places were called that in honor of what Yahweh did somewhere, but there's no record of anybody ever referring to Yahweh with those suffixes, right? When they said Yahweh, it was just Yahweh. They did not suffix Yahweh. Further indication that I know that the suffix is not something that they employed in worship is that later we find Jews who don't even really want to enunciate Yahweh. They found circumlocutions, roundabout ways. They would say Hashem, the name, or some of them would even do what you would call the breathing enunciation. It was just not really the full enunciation. There were different ways in which they would try to get around, because they thought taking the Lord's name in vain. I'm just telling you how many in the Second Temple period later ultimately developed this idea that taking the Lord's name in vain was mispronouncing his name and ultimately offending God, right? And so the point is that we just know that they weren't reading these texts and then learning, okay, here's another name for God, and then praying those names in prayer. Like I said, later, they hardly even want to say Yahweh, right? So they're not certainly adding a suffix onto it, because they hardly want to pronounce what's later known as the ineffable name of God, right? The tetragrammaton, they really don't want to say it. But I do think it's just, y'all jump in. I'm just rambling now at this point.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. There's another book by Anne Spangler called "The Praying the Names of God."
Right.
That yeah, a church I'm affiliated with is actually going through that at present.
Yeah.
And this same thing that you're talking about, we spoke about this today, even in Bible study, from the sense of another example of what you were saying. The reason why Moses named the place Mara is because the water was bitter there, and God had to make the water sweet. And because of what took place there, mainly the point that you made, the second point that you made was, it's because of what God did. And and let's be very clear on why these things were very pivotal for the children of Israel. One, it was for them to remember what God did for them, not only then, but for the generations to come.
Right.
Number two, what happened as pertains to them learning who God is. All the other gods, I said this in Bible study earlier on today, all the other gods, they heard about them to do things. However, they had never seen any of these gods, like the god of Egypt, the god of fertility, happy, all of these different gods in Egypt. They never saw God, that particular God, perform the very thing that they said they could do. However, Yahweh reveals himself by doing the things that Israel needed. He became, I saw our sister ask the question about, what about Lord of Armies or Lord of Hosts? That because of what he was doing and the might that carried. That had nothing to do with his actual name, but what he was displaying. Or am I still here? This thing keeps cutting out. Am I still here?
You are freezing up. Yeah,
you're freezing up a little bit. Yeah,
I hear you, but yeah, you're freezing up.
You can still hear me, but okay. I didn't know if I was still here. Yeah. So just to reiterate the point, that it's all to do with God making known to Israel that he is the I am. He is the one that can deliver. And because he delivered, that made him a person who was the one that it was almighty. He was the one that was in full control, because he was able to do. I said this also, and I'll stop here. The children of Israel was mocked by God because they made inanimate things and served these things, even though they knew that the idols couldn't speak, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't do anything. However, Yahweh was the one that did all of these things for them, as the one that was in control of all things.
Right. I do want to read 1 Samuel 1:3. So it's actually been brought up twice. She's not using, it's important to recognize the voices in the text. Hannah is not using the name Yahweh Sabaoth, which is what the Lord of hosts, that's how that would read in Hebrew, from Seba, which means army or host. Here's what it says. It says in verse 3, this man would go up from his town every year to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of armies at Shiloh, where Eli's sons, Hophni, Phinehas, were the Lord's priests. And as we go down, it talks about Hannah would weep and she wouldn't eat. Her husband saying, why are you and then verse 11, making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of you. So this is not essentially his name, right? So you'll notice what, so let me frame it this way. The reason that the writers are necessarily not really titling God, but framing God in this way is to communicate God's sovereign and divine protection of them, right? So they're saying this is who he is. So we have to think beyond name as titular or as a title, a way of vocatively referencing somebody, as in Jason, Rick, Damon. When he's being referred to this way from a literary standpoint, it is communicating something about him, not that this was his name in terms of the way in which they worshiped him or called him on a regular basis. And so in verse 11, what Hannah is doing here is exactly what the historian, be it Samuel or whoever, is actually doing. In verse 3, he says that Hannah's husband, who would bring her there, would go up to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of armies at Shiloh. And so then in verse 11, it actually has them, or has her, actually accomplishing that. Making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will not be cut. While she continued praying in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her mouth, and Hannah prayed silently, so forth and so on. Well, one of the things that we've got going on in the text is, which goes back to Genesis, is we can see indication of essentially two Yahweh persons here in the text. One Yahweh is present according to the text, and she is aware of Yahweh's presence. And one Yahweh she is essentially talking directly to. And you'll notice the text, it says, she says, she pleaded, Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction. But then later it says, she says, to that Yahweh, I will give him to the Yahweh, all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut, right? And so what we have there in the text is very similar to what we see in Genesis. One Yahweh, who we ultimately realize is the Father. And then there is an agent of Yahweh who is recognized as Yahweh as well, who essentially accomplishes many of the things or accomplishes the things that the Yahweh sender wills to have accomplished, right? And so you'll notice that she's talking to one that's present, and then talking about another Yahweh to which she would actually give her son to that Yahweh. So when she says Lord of the armies, in that sense, it is because she's acknowledging the present Yahweh there for what he was known for, his protection, his ability, his fighting for Israel. It's not to say that this was his name in a proper sense, is all I'm saying. This This is his name in the sense of this is his reputation. This is what Yahweh has become known for. He is the Yahweh of the armies, Yahweh of might, Yahweh of power, Yahweh who is sovereign and stronger than all of the other nations, right? And so it's not that she doesn't say that. It's that how do we understand that? It's not that she thinks that, well, this is another name for Yahweh. Let me use that name, because I need something from Yahweh here. So let me use the right name for the right situation, kind of a thing. And this is what I'm saying. A lot of the reason why we think that way is because we have been looking at these texts through the lens of pop theology, as opposed to understanding what's really going on in the text. It's more of his character. It's who he is. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. I agree. I think the text is unanimous. In the instances wherein Israel uses God's name as a talisman, or they use his dwelling place as a talisman, it is, or a rabbit's foot, it is rejected by God. One instance that I can think off the top of my head is in Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah is standing at the temple gate, and he tells them, do not trust in these lying words, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, right? Israel at that time was essentially saying, that was their way of saying, look, we have the temple in our midst, we cannot be touched, while they're sacrificing to other gods in that same temple. But they're using the temple as a talisman. And so to use God's name as a talisman is to use it that is to take his name in vain. To use it and to join it with something that has nothing to do with him, or to use it in a way of sort of that's transactional, where if I just say the right name, then I will get the right result, as if it's formulaic in some sense. It is not that.
That's what I'm saying.
I don't think it's that at all. And I think we also have to recognize, just to go along with your point, this is what I was talking about earlier today in our Bible study. This text exists in the Torah. That's very significant, because the Torah is not this idea of law as namas. That sort of term is more closely related to our idea of law. But Torah is really mainly the import of you will know.
Right.
So Genesis is part of the Torah. It's about how God is demonstrating how Israel will know. In this instance, you will know this about me. I will be your provider. At Meribah, I will be your healer. And in Egypt, I will be your deliverer. I am, like, for instance, you can even see this sort of idea where God's character is expressed through these names. Psalm 46 in particular, it'll use the name that we're talking about here, Yahweh Sabaoth, or where it talks about the Lord of armies there, the Lord of hosts. But it'll also say the God of Jacob, where it talks about right at the end, where it says the Lord of hosts and the God of Jacob will be our refuge.
So it's his name, God of Jacob?
Right, exactly. That's not his name, but the point is it's indicating that the God who delivers, who's mighty, who leads the armies, is also the same God who covenantally remembers us and has tied his reputation to us. This is why he will defend us, because he is the covenant God who remembers us. And so the point is, these aren't his names. These are descriptive of who he is. Therefore, we can recognize that though we're surrounded by the chaotic waters, our God, the Lord of armies, the God of Jacob, will be our refuge and will defend us. Even though the nations rage around us, they do all these different things, we will be secure, because our God has remembered both his covenant and he has revealed himself as one who can fight for us on our behalf. That God, his name is Yahweh, who reveals himself as the healer, as the deliverer, as our righteousness, so on and so forth.
There you go. In somebody mentioned Hagar there in Genesis 15, verse 13. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roy, for she said, in this place have I actually seen the one who sees me. This is why the well is called Bir Laharoi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So again, again, just keep in mind that this is what you would call an occasional or situational text. This doesn't repeat itself, and you notice you don't find anybody else saying, "Oh, I was talking to Elroy today, and Elroy spoke to me and said this, that, or the other." She is saying, "You are." She named him. She said, "You are the God who sees me," is what she's saying. So when it's saying she named him, this is another way of saying she called him. She said, "You are the God who sees me," right? It's not like she's giving him some personal name that she only, well, that's my personal name. That's my personal name for the Lord. That's our little thing. That's not what she's doing. She is recognizing that God sees her, and she's referring to him as the one who sees me. That's another way of saying naming somebody. In other words, you're saying about someone, "You see me," right? She's calling him in that way, saying, "God, you are the one who sees me." And so that's how we would take that. If we were to theologize, we would see this elsewhere. We would see other people worshiping and calling him this, but we don't. And that is another indication that we are reading the text the wrong way. That is why we don't see these things repeated. That is why we don't. And notice immediately what she does. She does exactly what we were just describing. She names the place according to what God does there, right? So God sees her, and then what does he do? He creates a well for her, right? He opens up opportunity for her to obviously be satiated, so forth and so on. So that is why the well is called Bir Laharoi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So you got to remember, water, Mayim is life, right? And when you are in dry desert areas, and there is no water around, you are in trouble. And so when God is providing water, that is major, right? And so, he brings her to this place where there is looking out for her. Even though he's sending her away or Abraham sent her away from his family, as God has instructed, God is still merciful and kind and gracious and loving, and still provides for her. And so she acknowledges this by saying, "Lord, you see me. You see me." And how does she know? Well, he's made a way for her to have her life sustained in a dry and arid place where she could have easily, her and her son could have easily perished. Right. So we've got to see it again in those ways, is all we're saying. Right. So yeah.
Can I add to that, Steve?
Oh yeah.
So currently in Exodus, we hear as Moses is having conversation with God. God says to Moses, "I have heard the cry of my people." This is not just saying that God has actually heard just in his hearing.
Right.
This is a motion for God to act and to make moves to change the situation that Israel is currently going through. Likewise with Hagar. Hagar says that you are the God that sees me, because God acts not only to save her and her child, but also grant her a blessing in that her son will also have these the opportunity, not only that he's sent out, but he's sent out not with nothing, but he's also blessed. Right. So it's not God just seeing as in being able to be visual to see, but he's seeing and acting on her behalf. And again, it's getting behind understanding some of the language that they use. For example, God was long-nosed or short-nosed, talking about being angry or being patient. I mean, we ain't talking about God having anatomy. We're talking about, how men would interpret somebody's anger and describing that or ascribing that to God. So we just have to understand
in anthropomorphic terms. Yeah.
Exactly my point. Exactly my point.
Yeah,
That's good. That's good. Any other place we want to visit before we start landing the plane? Any other chapter? Any other text?
Well, I wanted to just embellish this whole name thing again,
Let's
even
ride
more,
on that. Yeah.
because
That's good.
in particular, and I thought, Jay, I thought you were going to go to this in Exodus chapter 6, where God says to Moses in verse 2, where he says,
Oh, yeah.
God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But
That's
by
good,
my
Rick.
name, the
That's good.
Lord, I did not make myself known to them.
Mm.
Well, hold on now.
That's good, Rick.
Yeah.
Abraham knew he calls God Yahweh, because in the
Right.
text, in the Hebrew, it's the word, it's the covenant name, Yahweh.
Yeah.
So is this a contradiction?
Mm.
This is another place where the names we're focusing on what they functionally do, not just that did they know the name or the use of the name. It's about what the name is doing and what it's doing in context. Because obviously the fathers did know Yahweh. They knew that name. But when Moses is recording this in chapter 6 and differentiating between God Almighty and Yahweh himself, he is indicating that in the past, God was the promiser, but now God will be the performer. And so he's utilizing the difference there, saying, I revealed myself as God Almighty, but to you, I will reveal myself as the one who has kept the promises that were made to these fathers here. And so the difference is on the basis of promise and performance. So that's what, again, it's not about just the names themselves. Did they use the name? It's more about how did the name function in the life of the fathers. The name functioned as its promissory value. That's why
Right.
he's always introduced as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Even in the text right there, when you see that mentioned, that is a hearkening back to the God who has kept his promise. And so when Moses is utilizing this, where he's talking about, and I will establish my covenant with them and give them the land of Canaan and the land of which they lived as sojourners, right? And verse 7, right? Where I'll skip all the way down. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Again, what God does is he uses these events so that he can reveal who he is in time and space to the people. And so this is just another place wherein if you just get caught up, okay, let me say the name exactly, then that's the key. That's the key point from the text that I need to take away. You're missing it because the names are about how God has revealed himself in a functional sense to Israel and how I guess functions in the life of the covenant people, what it reveals about him. There's a reason why Hannah goes and uses this name, not in the sense that, well, if I say the name, it just invokes this magical, mystical power because I said the name, I enunciated. A lot of people will say that there's power in the name of Jesus, as in, if I just say Jesus, then if I say that, then my prayer is sealed. That right there is a sort of pagan transactional approach to God. You're using the name as in a sort of formulaic sense, wherein the name is revealed so that you can remember who you are to provide and to present and to give your petitions to. The reason why you're calling on God is because he is the only one who can provide, because he has revealed himself as the provider. And it's not as if you just use the name that then therefore you have the magic formula that gets you the answer that you desire. Again, that is transactional. That is rejected in the text. That is to engage in a relationship with God in a pagan way. You should not continue on in that frame as a believer. You shouldn't approach God like that, because that's not how he's desired to be approached.
That's good. That's really good. Jay, you want to say something on that?
No, I think all has already been said. I think it's just really important. If there's one thing I would say is we have a classic example in the sons of Sceva. They thought the formula to saying in the name of would help them. And the demons turned around and said to them, we know Paul, we know Jesus, but we don't know you. And
Right.
if we think that the formula is the way that we get to God by just saying the name,
There
no,
we go.
it's what's behind the name, one, and number two, who authorized you? A good friend says, who taught you? But who authorized you to go? Who authorized you to do the things you're doing? And if that authorization is not from God, then none of that means anything. None of that means anything. And Rick said it earlier on. They said, Lord, Lord. But they had no, and that no there should be known for everyone. That no is not cerebral knowledge, but it's a knowing of relationship and intimate love that God has or Jesus has for all of those that he has called to himself. So if he doesn't have that love, no matter what you call him, if he doesn't call you, as he said to Peter, you didn't come to me, I called you.
Yeah.
You didn't call me, I called you. I loved you first.
Yeah. I'm looking at this commentary on Genesis and Exodus. The commentator references Kasuto, and he says that it appears in context where fruitfulness is prominent, comparing Genesis 28:3, 35:11, 48:3. While that may be true in Genesis, it is not apparent in other occurrences, particularly not in Job. Oh, sorry about that. He says, but I did not reveal my name Yahweh to them. A literal translation would be, but in my name Yahweh, I was not known to them. And he argues, Kasuto argues, that this language favors the idea that this is not a new revelation of an unknown name, but introduces a further revelation of the character of God. And by name, it references character, which is what both of you were actually saying. And so again, most commentators, that's exactly how they understand it. It's not saying name as improper name, so to speak, but that what's happening with Moses is that there is some continuity with the ways in which God had revealed himself to the patriarchs, but he's furthering that revelation of himself with Moses. So ultimately now Moses will know more about God than Abraham did. He will not have a different revelation of God. He will have a further revelation of God. Just like when we understand God now through the hermeneutical lens of the person of Christ, we understand more about God than Jacob, than Isaac, than Daniel, than Isaiah, than Jeremiah. We don't have a different view of God than they did. We have the same view. Our view is further because it finds its full apex in the revelation, the incarnation of the Son, who fully revealed God. So we are seeing a further revelation. In fact, Christ is as far as that revelation goes. Hebrews 1 and 2, 1 and 1. In times past, he spoke to the prophets, but now he speaks to us through his Son. His Son is as far as that revelation goes. So what we're seeing is this progressive revelation in terms of the way that Yahweh is making himself known more and more. So this suggestion that this is a different name is not, or there was this unknown name before, and now you're knowing this. That's not what's being communicated. And again, I know that's how it sounds, but that's exactly why we don't do exegesis by how it sounds. We have to do exegesis by, well, what do they mean by, you know what I mean? And so just to affirm that, what both of you were getting after there is absolutely true. And essentially almost every commentary that you read on that is going to suggest that in one way or the other, that this is not, because clearly you would have a contradiction in scripture if that were the case, and that's just, it's not the case. So yeah.
I saw some questions.
Yeah.
Somebody was saying, based off what we said, it was the 937 podcast. It says, so is it wrong to reverence / acknowledge him or who he is in prayer? And I'm saying, no, it's not wrong to do that. I think because God has revealed himself as our healer or as our provider, we should, when we are in need of healing or we're desirous of it, or we're in need of things, because God has revealed himself, that's why we can go to pray to him. This is, again, just hearkening back to Psalm 46, because tomorrow I'm going to be teaching on it. That's why I'm like always in it currently right now. The reason why the psalmist, Asaph, or Korah is the one who writes 46. The sons of Korah write that one. The reason why they can say the things that they can say, especially in relates to how Israel or Zion is in the midst of this chaos, and it seems like the nations are going to rage and overtake them. The reason why they can pray and know that they will be secure is because God has revealed himself as the Lord of armies and the God of Jacob, who is our refuge, meaning from the storm, from the chaos, God is our covering. He is our shelter, so to speak. And so that's why they are calling to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's right to pray in that way. But the problem, I think what we're trying to distinguish for you is that it's not that you have to say the name in the prayer, because now you're entering in this formulaic thing. I have to say the name, therefore, or otherwise it won't be secure, or it won't be truly done, or it won't happen because I haven't said the name. It's, if you have that thought process, you're engaging in it, I would say, incorrectly. But if it's the thought process of saying, well, because God has revealed this about himself, I can now bring this petition to him, I think it's right. I think that's what God desires. He wants us to know. That's why in when I read in Exodus 6, the fact that God is now about to act is so that Israel will know that he is the Lord, their God. That's why he's acting, so they will know something about him, not so they can just recite the name and therefore it will corroborate their prayer. That's the difference.
Exactly. Good stuff. So we'll you can ask a question in the chat, or you can even come up. So we'll allow anybody who and you don't have to be brave just because we're not going to jump on you, but if you've got a question, or let's say you even want to kind of go back and forth a little bit with us, push back a little bit, and you feel like you've got some real legitimate basis for doing it, come on up and talk with us, right? We'll treat you with respect and kindly. And so come on up. That's the link. Come on up and ask your question, or if you have a respectful pushback against something, come on up and rap with us. And so we'll give you just about a minute or so to see if we see somebody pop up. But if you have a question, again, and you want to just ask it in the chat, ask your question. Make sure you put question in front of it so that we could spot it out pretty quickly. And but there you go. Come on up, come rap with us, and ask a question about Genesis. Anything that you want to know, anything that's been troubling you, or you're wanting some clarity on. It could even be on something that we dealt with, a couple of weeks ago. Maybe you weren't on when we talked about it, but there you go. There you go. There you go. Anybody? Come on up. Come on down, as Bob Barker used to say. Come on down. Is there anybody with any questions? I'll assume in about 30 seconds, if we don't see anything pop up. I don't know if they're on commercial break. I don't know what's going on, but if we don't see anything pop up, we'll assume that our work here is done for the night. Any questions in the chat, or any takers who are wanting to come up and ask their question. The window is closing. The window is closing. So while we're waiting on that to see if anybody anything pops up, any wrap up words, anything that you guys want to just throw out there that you know, add to the conversation, or even if it's takes us in a new direction, anything that you want to kind of land on, anything that you really want to get out and really stress before we start landing.
Yeah, I'll just go to one of the texts that Rick quoted back in Exodus 3 with the encounter with Moses. Verse 15 of verse 3 says, God also said to Moses, say this to the Israelites, the Lord, or the Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God, this is what Rick was talking about, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. Now here it is. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. So we have here God telling you who he is. He's already said, I am. I'm Yahweh. All of the other things is about what he will do. Just wanted to just kind of nail a coffin with that text to affirm the things that we've been saying about his name.
Yeah. I think that, man, that's really good. That's really good, bro. In that same, what is that? Chapter 3 that you were in chapter 3. I see
That's
something here.
3:15, yeah.
3:15. If you go back up to verse 2, where the Malach of Yahweh, the angel or messenger of the Lord, appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. And Moses looked, he saw the bush was on fire, but was not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush. There's Rick's Moses. And here's the thing that I want to point out. Here I am, he answered. Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I want to make a point here that I think is really important. So some of this culture that we're reading about, it doesn't dramatically change over time. For instance, if you were even to go into let's say Iran, in certain parts of Iran, Iran's a big country. You go to certain parts of Iran and you'll see Bedouin folk there, and the culture is not very different from what it was like when Abraham was there. You know what I mean? Like it's not drastically changed. So a lot of these cultural conventions, we'll bring Brother George up, but a lot of these cultural conventions they stick around for a long time, and one of them is that one of the ways to show reverence and respect for people who were considered greater was to bow down. That was another shakah. That was a way of showing reverence or respect for them. It's often translated worship. That's fine. That's what you did for people who were greater. Another way of doing it in terms of showing submission was to remove your shoes. It suggested that this person was greater than you and you were submitting to them. This is culturally why John the Baptist makes the statement that he makes when Jesus is like, I need you to baptize me. And John is like, I'm not even worthy to remove your shoes. He's saying, you shouldn't be submitting to me. I should be submitting to you, is what he's saying. And this grows out of a long-held cultural type convention. And you could see remnants of that still around in the Second Temple period. And so sometimes aspects of culture hang on for a really, really, really long time, and you can see carryovers of long held culture, thousands of years later, even, right? And there are aspects of that, for instance, still sticking around in some Bedouin cultures. For instance, if you go and you grab hold of the tent peg of the chieftain, he has the right to forgive and even bring you into his tent and cover you. And you see that kind of culture going on in the Old Testament, in the ancient Near East, and you still have Bedouin cultures today practicing these kinds of behaviors, even till this day. So I thought that was interesting there in the text. This notion of submitting. Moses is coming closer to God, and God's like, "You got to submit first. The ground you're standing on is holy. Take off your shoes," right? And it's not because the dirt is holy. Is not what he's saying. He's telling Moses is you recognize as you come closer and you recognize that I'm God. He's calling culturally on Moses to submit. Moses would have done the very same thing for a human that was considered powerful or greater in this kind of way, right? So that's what we're really seeing in the text when it comes down to remove your sandals from your feet, is a cultural way of saying show submission and humility in the face of greatness here. So yeah. Brother George, talk to us, man. Brother George, I think your mic is still muted. There you go.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you now.
Hey, God bless you, brothers. It's an honor and a privilege to be on your panel. My question is going back to the Tower of Babel, right?
Mm-hmm.
When God configured the languages, right? That, from based off the text, it's because of their rebellion and their sin, right? And because God is an all-knowing God, whether we obey his word or not, he has an answer for everything that we do. So even though, his plan was supposed to go one way, but the people did something different, he still had an answer for it. So and it's like it all his will still came to fruition because he is that all-knowing God. So that's the point I was just wanted to make, is that like,
absolutely,
because sometimes people try to discredit God because things may not look like how it should have went, but because he's still all-knowing. I think sometimes we forget that he's still all-knowing. He knew it was gonna happen. It's like, this is my understanding of it, of him being all-knowing, right? He knows everything, whether it's good or bad, and he already has an answer for it. So with that, it's like, it may not look like how you think it should go, but God still has an answer for it down the road. Okay, it went the way it should have went. He still have an answer for that going down that road. So that's my take on it. And if you guys want to expound on that,
that's good.
I
think one of the things that we were talking about when we were in chapter 11 is that even though we know Yahweh brings about judgment on those who are in rebellion, and ultimately out of that they get confused and they start gathering around those whose languages they understood, and then ultimately that starts leading towards people groups and nations and this, that, or the other. Where we were landing on that is that even though Yahweh uses confusion and sin and judgment to ultimately bring about his plan, the reason we said, well, that was his plan, we're leading with that. And the reason we're leading with that is because otherwise we'd have to end up concluding that sin is driving the narrative rather than God. Right. And so what ultimately ends up happening is what God wanted to happen. He just accomplishes it even through their rebellion. But sin is not driving the narrative. God is sovereignly driving the narrative. Right. And so so that really speaks to what you were just talking about. It really starts with God and it ends with God. God is bookending the narrative. What ultimately ends up happening is because he's sovereign. And so even though he brings about judgment, he still accomplishes what he intended. So God's on both ends of it, right? And so yeah, so I agree with what you're saying there, man. Good stuff.
I think another way to help understand this is what Joseph says about what his brothers meant and what God meant it for.
There you go.
Right there. I
Good
think that
stuff.
captures that idea right there.
Good stuff, Rick. Excellent. Good. Michael King. All right. Yes, indeed. Good to see you, brother.
Hey, how y'all guys doing? Can you hear me?
Doing good.
Good. Just want to say again, congratulations to you, man,
Thank you
on
so
the
much.
doctorate. God bless you on that. I have a question. Just wanted to ask, and I think it was mentioned a little bit earlier in Genesis chapter 17, where Abraham is asking God if Ishmael could be the one. And so my question is, when Abraham had
What chapter is
relations,
that?
chapter 17,
Okay.
verse, I believe it's verse 18, somewhere around there.
Okay.
So my question is, when Abraham and and Hagar have Ishmael, and then that time in between, before God reveals that he was going to have a child with Sarah. Um, why would God allow that span of time for Abraham to have Ishmael and believe that Ishmael was the one, and not like when it initially happened, God would have intervened and said, you know, you messed up or anything like that. So I'm just wondering, like, why that allowance of time for Abraham to be raising Ishmael to assume that he would be the one that God said that the promise would be. And then God comes back and says later that no, you're going to have a child with Sarah. Because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you correct me if I'm wrong, that it was legal to do what they did with the made, but it wasn't God's plan. I know it wasn't God's plan, but did Abraham know that it wasn't God's plan? Is what I'm saying, because of all of that time that was in between when Ishmael was growing up.
So let me ask you this: if you can summarize that question, like in just a synopsis, because I think I'm understanding you, but I'm not sure. Like
Okay.
narrow your question down as best as possible.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ishmael is older by the time God says to Abraham, Sarah is going to have a child. So my question is, uh, why do you think it was that length of time before God revealed to Abraham that it would be the child would come through Sarah?
I don't know why there's a I can't speak to why there's a length of time. I can say this though, that throughout the patriarchal narratives, the firstborn is the one that God chooses. That is just something that's a theme that's just running through it. Like the literal firstborn, the one in sort of first order as far as precedence, or not precedence, but just like chronology is concerned, is not usually not the one that's the firstborn. You see that with Esau and Jacob. You see that even with Jacob's sons. I think Joseph is not the technical firstborn, but he is treated as such. I mean, he's presented as that. That's what Jacob is intending to treat him as when he presents him as with the coat of many colors. And of course, God corroborates that, because Joseph does end up being and functioning in that regard of saving his family, functioning as that firstborn who has that responsibility to continue the family on. I think what's happening here in this text, like you said, and I like how you mentioned that this is legal. The surrogate sort of pregnancy is a legal thing. A woman could use her handmaid, and then the baby that is had through that copulation is treated as her child. And so I think this is Abraham trying to express faith. He's saying, look, God says we're going to have a kid, so let's make it active. Let's bring it forth. And so I don't think Abraham even knows until he calls on the Lord and says, oh, that Ishmael may stand before you, meaning may he be the firstborn. And God gives his answer. I think he learns right then and there that Abraham, your son will, and the line will come through Sarah, through her womb, not through a surrogate womb, but through her womb. And so I think he's learning right then and there. But as to why the length of time passes, I don't know. I don't think that Moses is interested in telling us why the length of time passes, other than to demonstrate that God can make the womb that's barren fruitful. Because I think that would be one of the things that I could confidently say as to why this length of time passes just in Sarah's life. Because even when Sarah hears about it first at the Oaks of Mamre, when those three individuals come, and one of which we know is, we could argue effectively that it's a pre-incarnate son of God there, that meets and says, in a year from now I will come back and Sarah will have a child. She laughs. She's like, I'm too old to have a kid, right? I think that the length of time and God waiting is just demonstrating that, look, I can bring fruitfulness out of what looks dead and barren. And I think that's another theme, especially with the matriarchs that you see in the book of Genesis. God speaks into the Itzabon. Now, this is harkening back to Genesis 3, the difficulty that will be had in the conception, the pregnancy, the childbearing, all of that will be mitigated in and through this covenant that God has made with Abraham. And that's why I think Sarah is barren, but from her barren womb comes forth some fruitfulness. And so I think that's also at play, but specifically why God waits this length of time between the birthing of Ishmael, him growing up, and him getting to a point where Abraham could ask God, hey, let him stand before you, let him be the firstborn, let the line go through him. And then Isaac coming, I don't know why God waits that length of time, brother.
So let me throw this out. Let me throw this out. So I and I'm glad you're bringing this up, Michael, because so when does Abraham get the idea that he's even going to have an offspring? I think in some senses we were reading the chronology backwards, right? Like, when does he get the idea? Because oftentimes we'll say, oh yeah, he went to Hagar because he just wasn't really trusting God. And what I'm saying is, obviously Yahweh does say to Moses in 12 that through your offspring, your seed, all nations of the earth are going to be blessed. He doesn't really elaborate on that, right? And you don't really see explanation of that. Obviously, that indicates that Abraham is going to have some offspring in order for the seed to be this blessing to all the nations. I'm not sure if Abraham understands that at this point. Here's why I'm saying that. Because when we get to 16, the thing that prompts, as you mentioned, the situation with Abraham and Hagar is not him going to her because he's looking for God to bring about, and I don't know how you're going to bring about this seed. It's because Sarah went to Abraham and said, because I think that the Lord has shut up my womb, perhaps you should go and have a child with Hagar. I don't think that has anything to do with this notion of this firstborn that's supposed this promised son at this point. I don't think Abraham knows anything about a promised child. I think he, like any man, hoped to have had a son to leave an inheritance to, and had probably given up on that, considering the fact that he's old and his wife is old. Well, she had at least given up on that fact, and so she says to Abraham, "Look, I'm already way too old for this, that, and the other. And when you don't have a child up to a certain point, culturally, they thought this was the Lord maybe punishing them. So she says in the text, not God said, she said, God has made me barren, and suggests that Abraham should do it. The reason I'm saying all of that is to say that it is only after this, in chapter 17, when Abraham does that, and he goes and he sleeps with Hagar, and then she starts acting like she's the number one, and Sarah gets a little jealous, and this, that, or the other. When she runs out, this is when Yahweh catches up with Hagar and tells her she's pregnant, and even tells her, you're going to even name him Ishmael, so forth and so on. And so the reason I'm saying that is, here's what happens right after that. Right after that incident, it says, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him, saying, I am God Almighty, live in my presence and be blameless. I will set up my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you greatly. This is the second, and only the second time, he's expanding on what he said in 12, with any particular reference to Abraham actually having some child that God is particularly promising. And so look at what it says. Then Abram fell face down. God spoke to him. As for me, here is my covenant with you. You will become the father of many nations. Your name will no longer be Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I will make you the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and I will make nations and kings come from you. I will confirm my covenant. That is, watch this, between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations. It is a permanent covenant to be your God and the God of your offspring after you, and to you and your future offspring, I will give the land where you are residing. This is the first time that Abraham is actually hearing from God an elaboration on the fact that he is going to actually give him offspring, that he is promising because you can't get offspring until you at least have one son. So there's got to be one son through which the rest of these offspring come from. So this is the idea of this promised son. My point is to say, Abraham finds out about this after he's already slept with Hagar and impregnated her. So I'm pushing back on the narrative that Abraham didn't sleep with Hagar as an act of, or a lack of faith. It was just a suggestion of his wife. They had not understood any promised child up to this point. Correct me, y'all, if I'm wrong, but the understanding of that unfolds later. It gets clarified later, because now God has to mitigate against the fact that you've got a son coming. So it's like God saying, I know you've got one coming, but let me tell you about the one that I'm really promising, that I'm making a covenant between you and your offspring per that one that I'm going to give you. But Abraham didn't know that before. That's my point. God is now saying that in light of the fact that Abraham is about to have a son named Ishmael, and God's now saying, that's not the one that I'm going to give you. But so Abraham did not act in some hasty way to say, let me help God out, right? Because he doesn't know about some promised son until God clarifies his original covenant from 12. If I'm on bad ground, y'all, come talk to me. Help me out with that.
I think chapter 15 kind of muddies that up though. Because in 15 it says, after these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abraham said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless. The heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir.
Okay.
And he brought him outside and said, look. And then, of course, we know what he tells. He shows them the stars and the sands, and he says, this is how your descendants will be. And so I think that phrasing there does indicate that God will give him a son. And because he's asking, how am I going to know? I mean, you've promised me in 12 that I will have this great name. And I think even there, having a great name in the ancient Near Eastern world is a part of that would be having a great number of children. That would be thought of as a great inheritance. A man that has a great number of children is thought of a wealthy man. And so I just think that I do agree with you that their action between Sarah, Abram, and Hagar is not a lack of faith, because we know that the writer of Romans, Paul, will say that Abraham did not lack in faith. He didn't. And so I think that he was just not trying to help God out, but saying, okay, this might be the way in which God wants to enact this promise that he has given me, and has expounded upon the promise in chapter 15. So therefore, let's go forward and do it that way. But none of that is him exhibiting a lack of faith. I don't think that's what's happening at all. But I would say that it does muddy the waters of saying that Abram doesn't know that God has promised him a son, or a promised son is in the works, because of what is said in chapter 15.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can see that too. The only thing that I'll push back just a little bit on it. What I mean by that in this sense is, when I say a promised son, I mean one who is particularly carrying the covenant. Right? What's happening here is God is simply telling Abraham that he's going to have an heir, which any man would have wanted, a child that he could leave an inheritance to. There's no, when we start talking about covenant, that is God's particular covenant with Abraham, that would have to be one that a particular one that God promises. And I think, I don't think you're wrong, but I think what's happening in 15 is God is saying you will have an heir. It won't be any of Eleazar's sons, because since Eleazar and his sons were property of Abraham, Abraham was thinking, well, I'll just leave my inheritance to one of them. And God's like, no, you'll have your own heir. That's not a covenant revelation at that point. That's just saying, no, you'll actually have your own physical heir. And mind you, Abraham was never the problem in the equation of whether or not he could have kids. Sarah was, right? Because Abraham, even after Sarah died, still had more kids, right? So he was never the wild card in the situation of whether or not he could actually have kids. So I think the way that he was acting with Hagar, per his wife's suggestion, would have been common, considering the fact that, I mean, Abraham doesn't know at this point that God's going to do something with Sarah. So if he's going to have an heir in any sense, coming out of his house, and it's not any of the slaves, well, it's going to be with one of it. I mean, that's the only way it could be, right? Is that it's not with Sarah. And so I think he's acting in natural conventions in the way that they would have. Well, yeah, if you have any child, any of your children, well, that first one is going to be the heir. I'm only really referring to more specifically the promised seed from a covenant standpoint. Whereas at 15, we're not at really covenant, we're at heir, right? It's in 17 where God clarifies that no, what I mean is you're not just going to have an heir. The heir is going to be is the one that I'm going to continue my covenant with. And notice what he says. And then his future offspring and those after him. I think that's a different conversation. That's all I'm saying. Is that there is some sense in which Abraham knows he's going to have, and I did give credence to that from 12. So God did tell him that through your seed, all nations of the earth is going to be blessed. So I think Abraham knows he's going to have a child at some point, but this notion of a promised son is not something that gets clarified until 17, when God's like, listen, the heir that I'm talking about is going to be one through which I am going to establish my covenant with after you. And then I'm going to establish my covenant with his sons and then his sons after him. And at that point, it's more than just about an heir in Abraham's house. It's about a covenant line. And that's where you start really understanding the distinction between who God has chosen and who God has not chosen, and why. This is why Ishmael is not chosen, because he's not in the covenant line that God has already, God has already chosen. So that's kind of where I'm going with it. But I do agree with you. There is some indication, at least knowing ahead of time, that God has promised that he is going to have an heir. So I do think that that is correct.
But, just going back a little bit with that, why is Abraham praying or petitioning God and saying, oh, that Ishmael may stand before you? The stand before you is covenant language, right? So he's thinking that the covenant, you could, I see what you're saying here. And I think
where does he say that? Isn't that in 17?
In 17, yeah.
Right.
So, and this is right after, in verse 15, we'll start there. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her, and I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you.
Right.
God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, like you said, Sarah, your wife will do that.
Right. But notice that comes after God says something specific in verse 7. I will confirm my covenant that is between me and you and your future offspring. It is at that point that he says, essentially, why can't Ishmael be part of the covenant since he's already here? It's basically.
I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So it's now more specific that it's not just about an heir, it's about a covenant. There's almost none of that language prior to. It's just heir language. You're going to have somebody from your own body. You're going to physically be the dad of an offspring, of an heir. But when it comes down to why God is removing Ishmael from the home, this is where God tells Abraham, here's what it's really all about. It's not just about you having a physical offspring. If that were the case, Ishmael could suffice. It's about the covenant that I'm making between you and a particular line, and Ishmael's not that. That's something that ultimately gets revealed after the fact. See what I mean? And that is when. And then once he hears the covenant piece, that's when he starts making attempt to bargain with God is like, well, why, well, why not Ishmael? God's got to tell him, no, that's not who I've chosen. So now God's coming out and clarifying, and it becomes clearer from 17 what it was really all about.
So
you know what I mean? Yeah.
What I think you're saying is, in the moment, this is happening in the moment.
Right.
And so after God has said this, Abraham goes, well, I have Ishmael. Let him stand before you. And what you're saying is, in 15, it is just about a son being born. And so up until God starts talking about covenant even more, because we could still argue in 15, he's still talking about a covenant. You have the maledictory Chaldean covenant cutting oath that's taking place in 15 with the pieces being cut. So there is a covenant being cut there, but the establishment of the covenant through the heir is not spoken of there. It's just the establishment with the covenant that's made with Abraham that's there. And then the continuing of it is now being in view here, wherein God starts talking about it in verse 7. And then Abraham in the moment says, look, I have Ishmael. Let him stand before you. And God's like, no.
And let's do the math, right? Remember when we were in 10 and 11, what we said? God had a plan. People tried to get in and do what they wanted to do. And God still utilized that to ultimately still bring about what he wanted. Okay, God has a plan. I think look at what Moses is doing. God has a plan, right? Yet, Abraham doesn't fully understand what God's plan is. And he's doing, well, he did say I was going to end up having an heir. I can't have one with my wife. And he's already told me that heir won't be any of the slaves in my house. I probably should just listen to what Sarah's saying and then just have the heir with the concubine. And that just makes sense to him. Now, that's not what God planned, but that's the way that they thought it would go. And so just like with 10 and 11, where God wants them to carry out the Genesis creation mandate, and they don't, God creates a situation that ultimately brings that about. I argue that the rift between Sarah and Hagar was instigated by God to ultimately bring Abraham to recognize what God was really wanting the whole time.
So I have a question. Because in 18 it talks about how God came to Abraham, and it's talking about how his wife going to get pregnant, and she heard this, she laughed, and different things like that. So when does that play a part? Is that after everything, or is it like before? Because we know like the Bible's not in chronological order. So how does that work?
Yeah, no, this is chronologically after the events that we are reading. Yeah, there is some chronology in some of these narratives, but for instance, 11 takes place before 10. But we recognize that because the narrative essentially creates what you would call a parenthesis. And so we know for a fact that was chronologically before, but these events are happening sequentially in the chronological way. So 18 occurs chronologically after the events of 17 and the events of 16. But that's a good call out though, because there are places where the point of the story is not following a particular chronology, but that doesn't mean that chronology doesn't exist in the narratives itself. Good stuff. Man, well, this has been great. This is well, it looks like we got one more person. We'll bring Brother Brown up on stage. We'll if you've got one question, and then we'll pretty much wrap it up.
This has been great. Well, looks like we got
all right. So you got to turn your sound down, because we can hear the podcast here in the background. All right, Brother Brown.
Yes. Hello. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. I like to just go back to when you were talking about Exodus chapter 6, and you were talking about Moses speaking to God, and God gave him a name, and then that name, he had said that the prior people in the Genesis time frame wasn't aware of that name, Yahweh,
Hmm.
and they were calling him God Almighty, or some equivalent to that. And as I come to understand it, is that Moses is the guy who was given the revelation of the Genesis account. So as he's telling the story from his perspective, but he's not really using the verbiage that they would have used. He's using the verbiage that he understands. And so my argument is that he's telling the story from the standpoint of being in the Exodus. So during the Exodus time is when God gave him the revelation of the Genesis account. And so by that time, he had already been introduced to God. He already knew God's name. And so he's inserting that name throughout the Genesis account. But the people that was actually living during that account, they weren't aware that that was God's name. And that's what God was telling Moses in Exodus 6. Does that sound like something that kind of makes sense?
Yeah, I've heard that argument before. Jason, Rick, either of you want to engage with that? I've got some thoughts on that, but I've heard that. So you're what you're saying is there are a number of scholars that actually argue that, right? And but go ahead, brothers, if y'all want to engage with his thinking on what that means.
I think that though that is presented as a viable option, I still think it doesn't deal with the reality of it being a contradiction in the text. I don't think it adequately deals with it because Abraham does, Jacob, Isaac, they do know God by that name. I mean, the text uses it, even though Moses is the author of this, but he records the events as if they know God as that name. And he's not just retroactively putting it there, it's actually revealed as that. And I think that the instance of him saying that by to the fathers I revealed myself as God Almighty, but to you I'm going to reveal myself as Yahweh the Lord. Again, it's on the basis of the difference between promise and performance, wherein prior to, even though the name Yahweh is known running through, but they knew Yahweh as the promiser. Moses and the children of Israel will know Yahweh as the performer of the promise that was given. And that's the real difference. And so when it's read through that way, it completely eliminates this idea of a contradiction, because the point of why Moses is saying, or God is saying this to Moses, is now, again, when you go down to verse 7, I believe, where it says, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burden of the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so they will know that. And now this is no longer a promise. It's no longer a promise where it will, it's going to, or it might happen, or it will happen in the future. This is now going to happen. And I will now perform it in and through this relationship that I have with you. You will mediate, or to be the mediator of these promises. You will be the vehicle that I have now employed for these purposes. And I think that's what's really going on there. Even though I know that those are views that a lot of Old Testament scholars hold, I just don't think it adequately deals with the contradiction problem. Because if it's just read sort of wooden literally, there is a contradiction, because again, in the text prior to this, the name is revealed.
Yeah.
The name Yahweh is used. It's like literally written in the text
Yeah.
itself.
I agree with what you're saying, Rick, and to confirm that in the text, and even what again the Casuto was saying there. He had mentioned where's Casuto's statement? Casuto mentioned that the language favors the idea that this is not a new revelation of an unknown name, but introduces a further revelation of the character of God. I think verse 4 helps us to see that a little clearer. 4 and 5. It says, I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land they lived in as aliens. Furthermore, I have heard the groanings of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are forcing to work as slaves. I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, tell the Israelites, I am the Lord. And I am the Lord. Tell them who I am. Watch this, though. Here's the furthering of the revelation. Not that the patriarchs didn't know the Lord. Here's another way that the Lord is going to be known that was not known by the patriarchs. Notice, I am the Lord, and I, Yahweh, will bring you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians and rescue you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. This is a way that Yahweh had not revealed himself prior to. He had not revealed himself as a deliverer, as a rescuer, because his people had not been in any kind of captivity before. I think this is the iteration of revelatory character that that Moses is talking about here in that verse. And does that make sense? Does that kind of help?
Yeah, it does. But if we think about it for a second, we have to go back to the idea that Moses is telling the elders a story.
We agree with
that. Like a fireside chat, or if you will. And he's describing from the beginning how God had showed him how he created all things, the Adam and Eve story, the flood. So he's telling all of these stories. And as he's telling the stories, he's telling it from his perspective as being under the law. So he's showing them how God, even in the beginning, had the law in mind. And so as they are about to receive the 10 words, they could then understand that what they were asked to do was something that was set up before the foundation of the world, and as such, God was indoctrinating them in a way that they would be able to understand, even though they didn't have much education, that they would be able to understand who he is, what he was all about, and how he began to explore and extend on his understanding, that they would be able to understand, because they were primitive people. They had just come out of bondage. They didn't know that the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was their Elohim. They didn't know that. Maybe a few of them did, but they had forgot about all of that. They had to be retaught all of these things. And Moses is telling them a story so that they could be brought up to speed. And as he introduces the name, which he did in the second chapter of Exodus, I mean, not Exodus, but Genesis, he introduced the name Yahweh, Lord God, Yahweh Elohim. He introduced that name, and then he began to expand on it. But it just came out of nowhere when he introduced that name. Well, they had no idea about that.
Yeah, well, so I think what you're doing, though, is conflating a couple of things. So I hear you, but you have to impose the assumption that Moses is, again, writing retroactively. You're assuming that. And you're assuming that when we see first person voice in the text, as in patriarchal speakers saying Lord, that's Moses's voice really acting retroactively. That's an assumption that you are imposing on the text. I can't go with that, because I have to trust that the first person voice is actually their voice. And even though Moses is writing it as the narrator, he's also using their voice. Now, here's the thing. These people lived a long time before Moses. So how would Moses know about that if God didn't reveal it to him? So
That's my point.
Either God, no, but what I'm saying is God's revealing it to him truthfully. So when Moses writes that Abraham said, Lord, God is revealing truthfully to Moses that Abraham knew the Lord, because Abraham's own statement is referencing Yahweh. You are arguing that Moses is simply writing retroactively, and that those first person speeches where they are in first person voice saying Lord are not real, that's Moses actually just retroactively putting that there, and that's imposing something on the text that the text is not doing. Further, here's where I would agree with you. I would agree that there's a generation in there that's not really walking with the Lord. They have forgotten his ways, and yet as Moses goes back to this generation, he is reminding them about who Yahweh is, and I get all of that. But that doesn't mean, I think that's where the conflation is. That doesn't mean that earlier generations didn't know Yahweh. Them forgetting about Yahweh has nothing to do with forgetting about his name. It has everything to do with forgetting about his who he is, and remembering that they are a covenant community. They had forgotten that, and they started living out their time in Egypt as though it was ultimately where they were supposed to be. And God sends Moses back to remind them that no, you're the covenant community, the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've called you out from this place into a place that I want you to be, right? So I just can't agree with this notion that earlier patriarchs didn't know the name Yahweh. I don't think that's anywhere in the text. That's an imposition based on an assumption that the first person readings is really Moses's literary retroaction in the text, and that to me is doing more than what I think the text is calling for. But man, I love you. I love the way you're thinking, though, and I love how you are looking, doing some work there and really thinking deeply about the text. And man, I appreciate you coming up and chatting with us and pushing back, like, man, I think that's wonderful. I love the way that you are engaging with the text and thinking about some possibilities there in terms of what that could mean. And we certainly respect your way of looking at it and thinking that, well, here's what I think it could possibly mean. And I'm not 100% on. I'll be honest, I am not 100% on knowing what that means. I have come to the conclusion, though, that here's what I think, because when I look at all of the evidence, the options leave me with choices that create significantly more problems than they actually resolve, like contradictions and this, that, or the other. So when I, deduce what it could mean, and I look at the evidence from earlier, even though I know Moses is the writer, I think landing where I think we've pretty much all landed is a more probable interpretation. But again, We're not being definitive
Can I
about
ask a
it.
question?
Yeah, go
Sorry.
ahead.
Let me finish. So let me just ask this question so I understand as well. So, Brother Brown, are you saying that away from Israel, Yahweh, the name Yahweh wasn't known at all until chapter 6? Is that what you're saying?
Actually, when at the burning bush, he actually used the name Yahweh.
Right, but I'm
But then,
saying it wasn't.
then in chapter
it was,
6, he reiterated and said that the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not know me by that name. They knew me by the name El Shaddai, which we call God Almighty. That was the name that they used back in that day. They didn't know him by the covenant name Yahweh. Moses knew him as Yahweh because God introduced him and gave him that name. And then Moses didn't know the name prior to that because he asked him, when I go into Egypt, what name should I use to talk to the children of Israel? And so then God gave him the name. And most people say, well, I am that I am. But actually, he said Yahweh. And then he said, I will be what I will to be. And then he went on to demonstrate that he could be whatever he needed to be by telling him to put his hand in his bosom, pull it out, turn the stick into a snake, back to a stick, that kind of thing, to demonstrate who he was. That's who he was supposed to go back to Israel when they were in bondage and tell them about this Savior who's going to use me to bring them out of Egypt. So that's where I came with that understanding, because I'm just reading the word and believing what the word says.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Brother Brown. In Genesis 15, this is what I mean by first person speeches. I get that we're getting this by God's revelation to Moses, right? But again, you're saying earlier they had never heard Yahweh until God says it to Moses in Exodus 6. There's a problem with that, though. And the retroactive
Exodus 3.
Exodus 3, yeah. But there's a big problem with that. And the retroactive interpretation doesn't account for what we are reading here. But Abraham said, Yahweh Elohim, what can you give me since I am childless and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? Right now. And Abram said, Yahweh, does the name Yahweh, let me ask you this. I'm going to see how honest you're going to be with the text. Does the name Yahweh come out of Abraham's mouth in this text?
I believe it does.
Okay, so then that can't be Moses retroactively writing it. It says Abram said.
That's part of the mystery of understanding visions and dreams.
No, but this is not a vision.
Things get said that doesn't seem to fit.
No,
but yet at the same time.
Yeah, but brother, now you are complicating the text in order to protect your interpretation.
No, I'm sorry.
And also, brother, you're not being consistent with your hermeneutic. You were saying that you read the text and you believe what it says just as you read it. But then when we get here and we're reading it as it is appearing on the text, now you are contextualizing it. Whereas before we were asking you to contextualize it via this idea of promise and performance. But we show you the text as it is written, literally, and you diverge from your hermeneutic in order to keep your conclusion afloat. Do you recognize that?
I understand that the word Lord God goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2.
No, not the word Lord God.
Well, the word Lord God is Yahweh Elohim.
Yeah. What I'm saying is,
so that's what I'm saying. Is that the first time the word Yahweh is used is in chapter 2. So that's long before Abraham. So what I'm saying is that Moses, when Moses began to speak about covenant, like with Adam, there was a covenant established. The word Yahweh was inserted.
See, but again, this is the problem that we're showing you.
Okay.
If you're using a retroactive interpretation, you're saying Moses is the one placing the name Yahweh in these texts. But when you're actually reading these texts don't carry. Like, for instance, if it only said what the Lord God said and the Lord God did, you'd have a very plausible argument, because that's Moses speaking from his standpoint about what the Lord God did then. That would be like if that's all we read there in Genesis, throughout Genesis, in the patriarchal period, if that's all it did, I'd be like, you know what? I think you are dead on. But when you get to texts like this, and it says, notice and Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans. God is literally speaking to Abram and using his name Yahweh. He's saying to him, I am. The Moses retroactive naming thing can't account for that, because this is a historical event that occurred between Yahweh and Abraham, wherein Yahweh says to Abraham, I am Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. And then he says to Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim, how can I know that I will possess that land? So this is where, dear brother, you have to just say, oh, wow, let me go ahead and submit to what the text is actually showing me, because you have first person to second person speech here, where one person is saying to the other person, I'm Yahweh, and the other person is calling that person Yahweh. Moses retroactively putting the name Yahweh couldn't account for that unless you do, and if you attempted to do that, you'd have to do damage to the veracity and the authenticity of these events. You'd have to say these events occurred, but Yahweh didn't really say he was Yahweh. He said something else. And that's not something the text tells us. The text says Yahweh said, I'm Yahweh. And you'd have to be saying, well, Yahweh didn't really say that because he hadn't revealed his name yet. And that would be disagreeing with what the text is telling us.
I think there's another evidence to this as well. I'll come alongside that. Just that could demonstrate, and that is the name of Moses's mother. Do you remember it? Jochebed. It's a theophoric name. And it demonstrates, I mean, what that means is that people were utilizing the covenant name and making it into compound words so that they can name people these things. Jochebed means literally the glory of Yahweh. That's what the name means, because it's a compound between a shortened version of Yahweh and kabod, or the glory. And so Derek Kidner, this is what he argues in his commentary on Genesis, speaking about what's going on in Genesis or Exodus chapter 6 here, is saying that since it appears that the name of Moses's mother is a sort of theophoric compound name utilizing the covenant name, it indicates that the name was already known in the Semitic culture of the Hebrews.
It's part of their naming convention already. So it's
exactly.
That's something I was not aware of.
Ah, there we go. There we go. And then I would also ask Brother Brown because we discussed this a little earlier, the the scene where God is calling Abraham and he reveals to Abraham that I want you to sacrifice your son. Do you remember what he named that place after God intervenes and provides the ram as a substitute for instead of Isaac? What did he name that place?
I don't remember, but I remember you said it earlier.
Yahweh Yireh. He named the place Yahweh Yireh. He says,
right, you said Jehovah Jireh. Yeah, that's what you said.
Because there the Lord provided.
Right.
Right. And so remember, that's a historical event that occurred before Exodus 3. So if he names this place, and this is an existing place, Mount Moriah is an existing place, and he called Mount Moriah, he named that one area. The Lord Yahweh provided right here as a historical event. He names the place after what Yahweh did. That tells you right there also that the name Yahweh was known because he names the place after what Yahweh did there. He doesn't simply name the place provision. He names it Yahweh provided.
So that would mean that in Genesis 4, around the last verse, and it said, men began to call on the name of the Lord, that was when they began to call on the name Yahweh.
Sounds like exactly like that's what that would mean.
Okay, I got it.
Good. I like that. That was so good. That was so good.
Yeah, we love it when people walk themselves into the answer.
Right.
Praise the Lord.
Man, Brother Brown, man, I really appreciate your spirit, bro. I tell you,
100%. 100%.
Yeah, this is so good, man. I tell you, this is good. Thanks for coming up, man. And yeah, you're always welcome. You're always welcome. And man, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up because we definitely have been on for a while. And but listen, I really appreciate are we done in Genesis? Do we have anything more to do? Because we can always do another book of the Bible the same way, where we can unpack critical text and this, that, or the other, and we'll talk about it. I guess we'll meet. Since we're getting together on Saturday, it'll be a good time to rap about that and figure out which one we're going to do next. And yeah, this is a lot of the people are like, man, this is good stuff. This is really, really good stuff. So yeah, we really appreciate you all hanging in there with us, sticking around and listening to biblical theological nerds nerd out. And so we're hoping that, of course, that's what you get a love for nerding out with the word as well. And that, this grows on every one of you, and it just really impacts the seriousness in the way, I shouldn't say seriousness, but the way that you take serious reading these texts and discovering the meaning there that is, cultural and literary and all these other things. So we appreciate y'all. And with that, we are out. God bless you. Thank you so much. Don't forget to support my September trip to Zambia. That's still on, by the way. I probably need about $2,500 more to hit my goal. And so if you I've putting up the screen. I don't have it on me right now, but nevertheless, if you go to my Facebook page, you can even scroll through. You'll see some of the campaign. You'll see where I'm announcing it and I'm posting it. I posted it multiple times, this, that, and the other. But you'll see the links to give either to the Spot Fund or to and I just have to find a way to get it running across the ticker here. next time I'm on live, that's what I'm going to do. So in that way, it's constantly across the ticker at the bottom, and that you guys will know what link to click on to donate to the spot fund. But I really appreciate all of the giving. Please be generous and help me. I just need about $2,500 more to reach my goal in terms of everything that we need to do in Zambia. But until the next time, God bless you. Thanks for joining. Yeah, go ahead.
Just answer the podcast question real quick. You said he asked, how often do you do this? So just respond to that, and then you can close out, bro.
Yeah.
There
So
you go.
so typically it's on Mondays and then occasionally on Thursdays. The rhythm for me had been thrown off because I was like the last 3 weeks, you hadn't even seen me, which is unusual for me to disappear for three weeks. But that's because I was trying to close the deal on the dissertation defense and this, that, and the other. And so I should be back on regularly on Monday. And if there is a second day, that will alternate between a Wednesday and a Thursday, depending upon availability or whatever. So it's all typically always on Monday. And then alternatively, I'll add a second show on a Wednesday and or a Thursday. Right. So that's typically the regular kind of routine of it. And so I'll start getting back more consistent with it now that I've closed the deal on the whole thing. So you'll start seeing me more regularly. So there we go. Excellent question. Yeah, I do. I need to pin it to the comments or the display. You're absolutely right. I appreciate it. Thanks for suggesting that, because that is something that I would be able to do. So we appreciate all of you. Thanks again, Mike King, for showing up, jumping on with us as well. And until the next time, God bless you. But I think that we need to be equipped to the point that we are at least what Peter said. He said, be ready to give an answer, not get ready.